The pounding on the door came before dawn, hard enough to rattle the shutters of the Whitmore house. Leora sat up in bed, her heart racing before her mind even understood why. Outside, torches moved through the streets of Thornhollow like a river of fire. Dogs barked. Somewhere a woman screamed a name into the dark. Leora pressed her hand to her chest and tried to slow her breathing, but the fear in the air was too thick to ignore. She knew what this meant. Everyone in Thornhollow knew. The Lycan king had sent his riders. Leora threw a shawl over her shoulders and moved to the window. Below, in the square, 6 huge wolves stood in human form, wrapped in dark furs, their eyes glowing faintly gold even in the shadows. Villagers knelt in the mud, heads bowed, too afraid to look up. At the center of the group stood a tall man, with silver hair and a face carved from ice. He did not shout. He did not need to. His voice carried across the square like a blade cutting through silence. "The king requires a bride," he said. "One daughter, from the finest house in this town, delivered by tomorrow's moonrise. Refuse, and Thornhollow burns before the week is done." Leora's stomach turned. She had heard the old stories about the Lycan kingdom, the pact made 100 years ago between wolves and humans to keep an uneasy peace. Every few years, a bride was demanded from a wealthy family, a symbol of loyalty, a hostage wrapped in silk, and called a queen. No one ever refused. No one dared. And in this town, there was no house wealthier, no name more respected, than Whitmore. Downstairs, she heard her father's heavy footsteps crossing the hall, then his voice, low and urgent, speaking with someone at the door. Leora crept to the top of the stairs and listened. "My daughter," Elias Whitmore was saying, his voice trembling with something that was not quite fear, and not quite excitement. "My daughter will go. She is beautiful. She is graceful. She will make the king proud." Leora's chest tightened. She already knew which daughter he meant. It was never her. She was 17 when the fire happened, the one that left a long pale scar curling from her collarbone to her jaw, the one that made her father look at her differently ever since, as though she were a piece of furniture that no longer matched the room. Her younger sister, Seraphine, was untouched by fire, or by fault. Seraphine had golden hair, a soft laugh, and a face that turned heads in every market from here to the capital. Their father called her his treasure. He called Leora his responsibility. Leora went back to her room and sat on the edge of her bed, waiting for the summons that never came. No one called for her. No one asked her opinion. She was 17, then 18, then 20, always present, rarely seen. By morning, the whole house was in motion. Servants rushed up and down the stairs carrying gowns, jewelry, perfumes. Her father's voice rang through the halls, sharp with instructions. Seraphine was to be dressed in the palest blue silk, the one that made her eyes look like the sky after rain. Her hair was to be braided with pearls. She was to smile, but not too much, humble, but never plain. Leora stood in the doorway of her sister's room, watching the chaos unfold. "You look beautiful," she said softly. Seraphine turned from the mirror, her lips pressed into a thin line. She did not look afraid. She looked furious. "I am not going," Seraphine said. "I will not be sold to a monster." "They call him a king," Leora reminded her gently, "not a monster. He is still a wolf, Leora. He still has claws. He still has teeth." Seraphine's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the vanity. "I would rather run than marry a beast." Leora did not know what to say. She had never seen her sister look so pale, so uncertain. For all her beauty and confidence, Seraphine had never faced a fear she could not charm her way around. This one had teeth of its own. Their father's voice echoed up the stairs. "Seraphine, the carriage is ready. Come down at once." Seraphine did not move. She stared at her reflection, as though searching for an escape route, hidden somewhere in the glass. Then, without a word, she grabbed a traveling cloak from the chair, pulled it over her gown, and slipped past Leora into the hallway. Leora frowned, confused, until she heard the soft click of the servant's door at the back of the house, the one that led to the stable yard. Her sister was running. Leora's heart pounded. She should call out. She should warn someone. But some small, stubborn part of her understood the terror behind her sister's choice, and she said nothing. Downstairs, the shouting began within the hour. "She is gone. My daughter is gone." Elias's voice cracked with panic as he stormed through the house, throwing open doors, searching every room, as though Seraphine might be hiding behind a curtain. Servants scattered before him like leaves in a storm. Leora stood at the bottom of the stairs, arms crossed over her chest, and watched her father's carefully built world begin to crumble. "The riders return at moonrise," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "If there is no bride, they will burn this town to the ground. They will burn this house." He turned, and for the first time in years, his eyes landed on Leora, and actually saw her. "You," he said. Leora felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Father, I am not." "You will go," he said, already moving toward her, already reaching for her arm. "You will wear her dress. You will say her name if you must. The wolves have never met either of you. They will not know the difference." "They will know," Leora said, pulling back. "I do not look like her. I do not sound like her. I am not." "You are my daughter," Elias snapped, his grip tightening. "And tonight, that is enough." There was no time to argue, no time to run as Seraphine had. Servants swept in around her, unclasping her plain gray dress, pulling the pale blue silk over her head, the fabric still warm from Seraphine's body. Someone tugged a comb through her hair, twisting it into the same careful braid meant for her sister. A necklace of pearls, cool against her throat, hung heavy where her sister's scarless skin should have been. Leora caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror as the servants worked, and for a moment she did not recognize the girl looking back. The gown fit strangely on her frame, too loose in some places, too tight in others. The scar along her collarbone peaked above the neckline no matter how the servants tried to arrange the fabric. She looked like a girl playing dress-up in someone else's life. "Cover it," her father ordered, gesturing at her scar. "Use the powder, quickly." A servant dabbed pale powder over the old mark, but it did little to hide the raised line of skin. Leora stood still and let them work, her mind far away, wondering what would happen when the wolves discovered the truth. Would they simply kill her? Would they burn the town anyway, out of anger at being tricked? She thought of asking her father these questions, but one look at his face told her he had not considered them at all. He was thinking only of tonight, of the deadline, of saving his name and his house. Whatever came after did not seem to matter to him. By the time the carriage rolled to the edge of town where the wolves waited, the sun had already sunk behind the hills, painting the sky in deep orange and violet. Leora sat alone inside, her hands folded tightly in her lap, listening to the wheels grind over the dirt road. Her father rode alongside on his horse, calling out final instructions through the window. "Keep your eyes down, speak only when spoken to. Smile, if you can manage it. And whatever you do," he said, his voice dropping lower, "do not tell them your name is Leora." She wanted to laugh, though nothing about the moment was funny. Even now, sending her to a fate he could not predict, he was still ashamed of her. The carriage stopped at the edge of the square, where torches burned in a wide circle, and the 6 wolves stood waiting exactly as they had at dawn. In their center, a new figure had appeared, one who had not been there before. He stood taller than the others, dressed simply in black, with no crown, no jewels, nothing to mark him as royalty, except the way every wolf around him bent slightly at the shoulders, as though bowing without meaning to. His hair was dark, almost black, and his eyes, even from a distance, seemed to catch the torchlight in a way that no human eyes could. When he turned his head toward the carriage, Leora felt a strange pull in her chest, as though something inside her recognized something inside him, though she had never seen this man in her life. The carriage door opened. Her father's hand appeared, gesturing for her to step down. Leora took a breath, smoothed the silk of her sister's gown over her trembling hands, and stepped out into the torchlight. The silver-haired man who had spoken that morning approached first, studying her with narrowed eyes. "This is the daughter of Whitmore," he said, though it sounded more like a question aimed at her father than a statement. "Yes," Elias said quickly, "my finest, my treasure." Leora kept her eyes down, as instructed, staring at the packed dirt beneath her slippers. She could feel the weight of every gaze upon her, human and wolf alike, and beneath all of it, one gaze in particular, heavier than the rest, coming from the man standing at the center of the circle. He had not spoken yet. He simply watched her, his head tilted slightly, as though listening to something only he could hear. Bring her closer, he said finally, his voice low and even, carrying an authority that needed no volume to be obeyed. The silver-haired man took Leora gently by the arm and guided her forward, past the ring of torches, until she stood only a few steps from the king himself. Up close, he was even more striking than she had first realized, his features sharp and unreadable, his presence so commanding that the air itself seemed to bend around him. He studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he leaned down, close enough that she could feel his breath against her skin, and inhaled softly, as wolves do, reading truths that words could never carry. Leora's whole body went rigid. She knew, in that instant, that whatever disguise her father had built for her, whatever lie had been stitched into the silk of this gown, it was about to unravel in front of everyone. The king straightened, his golden eyes fixed on her father, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it cut through the square like a blade drawn from its sheath. "This is not the daughter your messenger described to my council," he said. "Her scent carries none of the pride, none of the vanity you spoke of. She carries fear. She carries grief. She carries a scar that has nothing to do with fire, and everything to do with how she has been treated in her own home." Elias's face went pale. "Your Majesty, I assure you, do not assure me of anything," the king said, and though his voice never rose, every torch in the square seemed to flicker at the force behind his words. "Tell me the truth, Whitmore, or I will smell the lie the moment it leaves your mouth." For the first time in Leora's life, she watched her father's confidence collapse entirely. His mouth opened and closed twice before any sound came out. "My other daughter," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "She ran. She fled before the carriage arrived. This is my elder daughter, Leora." A murmur rippled through the crowd of villagers still kneeling at the edges of the square. Leora felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, standing exposed in her sister's gown, her secret laid bare before wolves and neighbors alike. The king said nothing for a long moment. He simply looked at her, really looked, the way no one in her family ever had. Not at the scar, not at the silk that did not belong to her, at her. "Leora," he said, testing the name as though weighing its worth. "And where is the sister who was promised to me?" "Gone, your Majesty," Elias stammered. "Fled into the countryside. I do not know where. I swear it." The king turned back to Leora, and something shifted in his expression, something she could not name. Not pity, not anger. Something closer to recognition, as though he had been searching for a particular face in a crowd, and had, quite unexpectedly, found it. "Your father meant to send me beauty wrapped in silk," he said. "Instead, he has sent me honesty wrapped in fear." He paused, studying her a moment longer. "I find I prefer what arrived." Leora's breath caught in her throat. Beside her, she heard her father exhale, as though the sound of those words had saved his life. In many ways, it had. The king turned to his silver-haired companion. "Rurik, prepare the girl for travel. She rides with us tonight." "Your Majesty," Rurik said carefully. "The pact requires the daughter promised, not a substitute chosen in panic." "The pact requires a daughter of Whitmore," the king replied, his eyes never leaving Leora's face. "It says nothing about which one." Leora's mind raced, trying to understand what was happening, trying to understand why a king who could have condemned her for the deception was instead choosing to keep her. She wanted to speak, to ask why, to demand some explanation for the sudden shift in her fate, but the words would not come. All she could do was stand there, trembling in her sister's stolen gown, staring into the eyes of a stranger who had just decided her future in the span of a single breath. Behind her, she heard her father's voice, thick with relief rather than concern. "Thank you, Your Majesty. Thank you for your mercy." Leora did not turn to look at him. She kept her eyes on the king instead, on the strange calm certainty in his expression, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that someone had truly seen her, and had not looked away. "Come," the king said, extending a hand toward her, not as a command but as an invitation. "Your life in Thornhollow ends tonight, Leora Whitmore. What begins after this moment is yours to discover." The torches burned bright around them as she reached out and placed her hand in his, and somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the fear and the confusion and the disbelief, something new began to stir. Not quite hope, not yet, but something close enough to it that she could feel its warmth spreading through her, chasing away, if only slightly, the cold she had carried for so long. Behind them, the wolves began to move, forming a path toward the horses waiting at the edge of the square. Leora took one last look at the house that had never truly been her home, at the father who had only ever seen her as a last resort, and then she turned forward, toward a kingdom she had never seen, led by a king who had, against every expectation, chosen her. The night swallowed Thornhollow behind them, and Leora rode into the unknown with her heart pounding, uncertain of what waited ahead, but certain, for the first time, that whatever it was, it belonged to her, and no one else. The horses moved fast once they left the square, faster than any carriage ride she had known. Leora sat astride a dark mare led by one of the king's riders, gripping the reins with hands that had never held them before. The wind pulled loose strands of hair from her ruined braid and stung her eyes, but she did not close them. She wanted to see everything. She wanted to remember every tree, every hill, every star that marked the road away from the only home she had ever known. Beside her, close enough that his horse's shoulder nearly brushed hers, rode the king. He said nothing for a long while, and she was grateful for the silence. Her mind was too full to hold a conversation, too crowded with questions that had no answers yet. Why had he chosen her? What did he see in her that her own father never had? Was this mercy, or was it simply convenience, a king too proud to return to his court empty-handed? She glanced sideways at him once, quickly, and found his gaze already on her. She looked away just as fast, her cheeks warming despite the cold night air. "You are afraid," he said, his voice carrying easily over the sound of hooves against the road. "Should I not be?" Leora asked before she could stop herself. It was not the way she had been taught to speak to nobility, let alone to a king who ruled by claw and fang, but something about the darkness, the distance from her father's watchful eyes, loosened her tongue. "Perhaps," he admitted. "I am not in the habit of offering comfort to strangers, but I will tell you this much. You have nothing to fear from me tonight." "And tomorrow?" she asked. A faint sound escaped him, something close to a laugh, though it did not quite reach his eyes. "Tomorrow we will see." They rode in silence again after that, the road curving upward into hills Leora had only ever seen from a distance, dark shapes against the horizon that marked the edge of human land and the beginning of the Lycan territory. As the ground rose beneath them, the trees grew taller, older, their branches twisting overhead like the ribs of some enormous sleeping creature. The moon, full and heavy, hung low enough to seem close, close enough to touch. Leora had never traveled this far from Thornhollow. She had never seen a forest like this one, thick with shadows that seemed to move on their own, alive with sounds she could not identify. Somewhere in the distance, a long, low howl rose into the night, answered a moment later by another, and another, until the whole forest seemed to hum with the voices of unseen wolves. She flinched at the sound. The king noticed. "They are announcing our return," he said, his tone almost gentle. "Nothing more. No harm will come to you." "How can you promise that?" Leora asked. "You do not know me. You met me an hour ago." "I know enough," he said simply. She wanted to press him further, to demand a real answer, but the road curved sharply then, and the trees fell away all at once, revealing the first sight of the Lycan stronghold rising from the mountainside ahead. Leora's breath caught in her throat. She had imagined something crude, perhaps, a fortress built for war, cold stone and iron gates meant to intimidate. What she saw instead took her breath away. Towers of pale gray stone rose against the night sky, their peaks catching moonlight like silver. Great arched windows glowed with warm firelight from within, and banners bearing the mark of a running wolf beneath a crescent moon hung from the highest walls, moving gently in the mountain wind. It looked less like a fortress and more like something carved from a dream, ancient and beautiful and utterly foreign to everything she had known. "It is called Duskmere," the king said, watching her reaction with quiet interest. "It has stood for 300 years. My family has ruled from these halls since the first pact was written between our peoples." "It is beautiful," Leora said honestly, forgetting for a moment to be afraid. Something in the king's expression shifted, softened, though he said nothing more as they approached the great gates. Guards in dark uniforms bowed low as the group passed through, and Leora felt dozens of eyes upon her, curious, calculating, some openly hostile. She kept her chin lifted, remembering, strangely, the way her sister always carried herself in public, shoulders back, eyes forward, as though daring anyone to find fault with her. It was the first time in her life Leora had ever tried to imitate Seraphine's confidence, and she found, to her surprise, that it helped. Inside the courtyard, servants rushed forward to take the horses. Rurik dismounted quickly and moved to assist the king, though the king waved him off and instead came around to Leora's mare himself, offering his hand to help her down. She hesitated only a moment before accepting it, her fingers small and cold against his warm, steady grip. Her feet touched solid ground, and for a moment, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. "Rest tonight," the king said, releasing her hand. "Tomorrow, there will be much to explain, much for you to understand. Tonight, you have earned peace." "Why?" Leora asked quietly. "Why choose me, when you could have sent me back and demanded my sister instead? Why not punish my father for his lie?" The king studied her for a long moment before answering, his golden eyes reflecting the torchlight along the courtyard walls. "Because your father sent me a lie wrapped in silk, expecting me to be fooled by beauty alone," he said. "Instead, I found honesty standing in fear, refusing to break even, when everything around her demanded that she should. That is worth more to me than any bride chosen for her face." Leora had no answer for that. She simply stood there, wrapped in the strange warmth of his words, as a servant appeared to guide her toward the castle's inner halls. Before she followed, she glanced back once at the king, who remained standing in the courtyard, watching her with an expression she could not quite name. Whatever tomorrow held, whatever explanations waited beyond the doors of Duskmere, Leora understood one thing clearly as she crossed the threshold into her new life. The girl who had spent years, unseen in her father's house, had, in the span of a single night, become impossible for anyone to overlook. And somewhere deep in the shadows of the great stone halls, unseen eyes watched her arrival, with far less warmth than the king's, marking her as an intruder in a world that was never meant to welcome her. Leora woke to the sound of birds she did not recognize, their calls sharp and unfamiliar against the quiet of an unfamiliar room. For a moment, disoriented, she thought she was still in her small bedroom in Thornhollow. Then her eyes opened fully, and she remembered. The stone walls, the tall arched window, the heavy fur blanket pulled over her instead of the thin quilt she had known her whole life. She was in Duskmere. She was in the Lycan king's stronghold, and the events of the previous night had not been a dream. A soft knock came at the door before she could gather her thoughts. A young woman entered, carrying a tray of bread, fruit, and something that smelled like honeyed tea. She had warm brown eyes and dark curls pulled back from her face, and she smiled at Leora with an openness that felt almost startling after the cold formality of the night before. "Good morning," the woman said. "I am Mira. I was asked to look after you while you settle in." "Thank you," Leora said carefully, sitting up and pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "Are you one of them? A wolf?" Mira laughed, setting the tray down on a small table near the window. "I am. Born here, actually. Not everyone in Duskmere was born human and turned, or born wolf and stayed wild. Some of us are simply born into this life, same as you were born into yours." Leora considered this as she reached for a piece of bread, her stomach reminding her she had not eaten since the morning before, back when her world had still made sense. "I did not think wolves would be so kind." "Not all of us are," Mira admitted, her smile fading slightly. "I will be honest with you, since I think you deserve honesty after the night you must have had. There are many here who do not trust humans easily, especially not one who arrived under such strange circumstances. Word travels fast in these halls." Leora's throat tightened. "They know I was not the one promised." "Everyone knows," Mira said gently, "but do not let that frighten you too much. The king does not choose his companions to please his court. He never has." Leora wanted to ask what that meant, exactly. What kind of king ruled without regard for the opinions of those beneath him? But before she could form the question, a sharp knock interrupted them. Mira opened the door to reveal Rurik, the silver-haired man from the night before, standing tall and unsmiling in the corridor. "The king requests her presence," he said, his eyes flicking briefly to Leora, before returning to Mira. Now, if she is able. I am able, Leora said, rising from the bed before Mira could answer for her. She was not going to let this man, or anyone else in this castle, believe she needed to be spoken for. Mira helped her into a simple gown of deep green, far plainer than the borrowed silk from the night before, but it fit her properly, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Leora felt as though she were wearing something meant for her own body, rather than someone else's life. She followed Rurik through winding stone corridors, past tapestries depicting wolves running beneath moonlit skies, past guards who watched her pass with expressions she could not read. The throne room, when they reached it, was smaller than she expected, though no less impressive. Tall windows lined one wall, filling the space with pale morning light. The king stood near one of them, his back to the door, looking out over the mountains beyond. He turned as she entered, and something in his expression eased slightly at the sight of her. "Leave us," he said to Rurik, who hesitated only a moment before obeying, closing the heavy doors behind him. Leora stood near the entrance, unsure of the proper way to address a king, unsure of anything in this strange new world. "Your Majesty," she began. "Kale," he corrected. "When we are alone, you may call me Kale." The informality surprised her. "Kale," she repeated slowly, testing the shape of his name. "I do not understand why I am here, truly. Last night you spoke of honesty, of choosing me over my sister, but a king does not simply keep a bride out of curiosity. There must be more to this." Kale studied her for a long moment before answering, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the commanding authority she had heard in the square. It was quieter, more careful, as though he were choosing each word with great deliberation. "There is a bond among my people," he said, "a connection that forms between certain pairs, one that cannot be forced, cannot be arranged, cannot be faked, no matter how skilled the deception. It is rare. Many wolves live their entire lives without ever finding it." Leora's chest tightened. "And you believe you have found it, with me?" "I do not yet know," Kale admitted. "Last night, when I first caught your scent, there was something familiar in it, something that called to the wolf within me, in a way I have never experienced before. It is not confirmed, not yet. But it is enough to warrant keeping you here, to allow time to discover the truth of it." Leora sat down slowly on a nearby bench, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. "And if it is true, what happens then?" "Then you become my queen," Kale said simply, as though the matter were as ordinary as the changing of seasons. "Bound to me, and I to you, for the rest of our lives." "And if it is false?" Something flickered across his face, brief and unreadable. "Then you will be free to return home, with my protection, and my gratitude for your patience." Leora almost laughed at that. Home. As though Thornhollow, as though her father's house, had ever truly been a home to her. She thought of Elias's relief, when the king spared him consequence for his lie, of the years she had spent invisible in her own family, and she wondered whether there was truly anything left in that town worth returning to. "How long?" she asked instead, "before you know for certain?" "Weeks, sometimes months," Kale said. "The bond reveals itself slowly, through closeness, through trust. There is no way to rush it, no way to force its arrival if it is not meant to be." Leora absorbed this information in silence, turning it over in her mind like a stone worn smooth by a river. Weeks, perhaps months, spent in this castle, among strangers who did not want her here, waiting for a bond to reveal itself, or fail to, with no control over the outcome either way. "What happens to my sister?" she asked suddenly. "Seraphine, will you send riders after her? Will she be punished for running?" "No," Kale said, and something in his tone told her this was not a decision made lightly. "The pact required a daughter of Whitmore. You fulfill that requirement. I have no interest in punishing a girl for fleeing a fate she never chose." Leora felt a small, unexpected wave of relief at his words. Whatever else was true about this strange king, whatever uncertainty lay ahead, he did not seem to be a man who took pleasure in cruelty for its own sake. "There is something else you should know," Kale continued, his expression growing more serious. "Not everyone within these walls will welcome your presence easily. Some among my court believe a human bride weakens our line, weakens our claim to strength in the eyes of other packs. You may face suspicion. You may face open hostility, though I will not allow harm to come to you. You cannot control what others think of me, Leora said quietly. No, he agreed, but I can control what happens to those who act on those thoughts. There was something steady in the way he said it, something that made Leora believe, despite every reason she had to doubt the men and women who ruled her fate, that he meant every word. The days that followed passed in a strange blur of learning and adjustment. Mira became her constant companion, guiding her through the sprawling halls of Duskmere, teaching her the customs of a court she had never imagined she would need to understand. Leora learned which wolves held positions of power, which ones watched her with open curiosity, and which ones, like Rurik, regarded her with barely concealed distrust. Rurik, she quickly discovered, believed firmly that the king's choice endangered the stability of the kingdom. He never spoke his objections directly to her, but she caught the tension in his jaw whenever she entered a room, the way his eyes followed her movements, as though cataloging every possible threat she might pose. He does not hate you, Mira explained one afternoon, as they walked together through the castle gardens, a space of quiet beauty tucked behind the eastern wall, filled with silver-leafed trees and flowers that seemed to glow faintly in the shade. He simply does not trust easily. None of us do, not after what happened with the last human who came through these gates. Leora paused, curious despite herself. What happened? Mira's expression grew somber. That is not my story to tell. Perhaps in time, someone else will share it with you. For now, know only that Rurik's caution comes from experience, not cruelty. Leora did not press further, though the mystery lingered in her mind for the rest of the day, a small dark thread woven into the otherwise bright tapestry of her new life. She thought of it again that evening, as she sat alone in her chambers, watching the moon rise over the mountains beyond her window, wondering what secrets this ancient castle still held, and how many of them might, in time, come to matter to her more than she could yet imagine. Outside her door, unseen and unheard, quiet footsteps paused for a long moment before continuing down the corridor, carrying with them thoughts far less gentle than the moonlight spilling across the stone floor. 3 days later, Leora found herself summoned to the training yard, a wide stone courtyard where several wolves practiced sparring, in both human and shifted forms. She had not been told why she was needed there, only that Kale requested her presence, and so she went, trailing after a young guard, who seemed nervous to even walk beside her. She found Kale standing at the edge of the yard, watching a pair of young wolves circle each other, muscles tensed beneath their fur. He turned when he sensed her approach, and something in his expression eased the moment their eyes met, a small shift that she was beginning to recognize whenever he looked at her. "You wished to see me?" she asked. "I did," he said, gesturing for her to walk with him along the edge of the yard, away from the clashing sounds of practice. "I thought it might help you to understand more of who we are, beyond the walls of the castle and the formalities of court. My people are not simply soldiers and nobles. We are hunters, protectors, family bound by more than blood." Leora watched the wolves training, marveling at the fluid grace of their movements, so different from anything she had witnessed among humans. "It is beautiful," she admitted. "Frightening, but beautiful. Most things worth respecting carry both qualities," Kale said. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, past the training yard, and into a quieter section of the castle grounds, where a low stone wall overlooked the valley far below. Leora leaned against the cool stone, taking in the view, the endless stretch of forest and distant rivers catching the afternoon light. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Of course. Mira mentioned a human who came here before me. She would not tell me the story." Leora watched his face carefully as she spoke, searching for any reaction. Rurik seemed troubled by the memory of it. Kale's expression grew distant, his gaze drifting toward the horizon, as though searching for something long past. "Her name was Wren," he said finally. "She came here many years ago, under similar circumstances to your own, though her intentions were far less honest than yours have been. She used her position to gather information for enemies of this kingdom, enemies who sought to weaken our borders from within." Leora's stomach tightened. What happened to her? "She was discovered before real damage could be done," Kale said. "But the betrayal cost lives. Good wolves, loyal to this kingdom, died because they trusted someone who did not deserve that trust. Rurik lost someone close to him in the aftermath. He has not fully forgiven himself for failing to see the danger sooner. Leora absorbed this new information slowly, understanding now the weight behind Rurik's suspicious glances, the careful distance he kept from her at all times. It was not simply distrust of humans in general, it was fear born from real loss, real consequence. "I am not her," Leora said quietly. "I know," Kale replied, turning to look at her directly. "I would not have brought you here otherwise. But you must understand why patience is required, why trust within these walls cannot be given freely, no matter how much I might wish it could be different." "I understand," Leora said, and she found, to her own surprise, that she truly did. The wariness she had felt from the court no longer seemed like simple cruelty. It was armor, built from real wounds, worn by people who had learned the hard way what carelessness could cost them. "There is something else," Kale said, his tone shifting slightly, growing more careful. "Tomorrow night, there will be a gathering, a formal dinner, attended by several members of my council. It is customary for them to meet anyone who might one day stand beside me as queen. I would understand if you wished to decline, given the circumstances, but I believe it would be beneficial for you to be seen, to be known, rather than remaining a rumor whispered through these halls." Leora considered this, weighing the fear of facing an entire room of suspicious wolves against the quiet isolation of hiding away in her chambers indefinitely. She thought of her sister, of the confidence Seraphine always carried into every room, and found herself straightening her shoulders in imitation of that same fearless posture. "I will attend," she said. Something like pride flickered across Kale's face, quickly hidden, but not quickly enough for Leora to miss entirely. "Good," he said simply. "Mira will help prepare you. And Leora, whatever happens in that room tomorrow night, know that you do not stand alone in it." The words settled over her like a warm cloak against the mountain chill, and for the first time since arriving at Duskmere, Leora allowed herself to believe, if only slightly, that this strange new life might hold more than fear and uncertainty. It might hold the beginning of something she had never known before, something that felt, against every expectation, like belonging. That night, as she lay awake in her chambers, listening to the distant howls that had once terrified her, and now felt almost familiar, Leora thought of the dinner ahead, of the suspicious eyes that would study her from every corner of that hall, and wondered how many of them carried wounds like Rurik's, hidden beneath careful masks of formality and distance. Whatever tomorrow brought, she resolved to face it with the same quiet strength that had carried her through every rejection, every dismissal, every year spent unseen in her father's house. She had survived being overlooked. She would not be undone now by simply being seen. The great hall of Duskmere glowed with candlelight, dozens of flames flickering against polished stone walls, hung with banners bearing the crescent moon and running wolf. Long tables stretched down the center of the room, laden with roasted meats, dark bread, and wine, so deep red, it looked almost black in the dim light. Leora stood at the entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs, and tried to remember how to breathe. Mira had dressed her in a gown of deep silver, simple in design, but elegant in a way that felt honest, rather than borrowed. Her hair had been left mostly loose, with only a few strands braided back from her face, and for once, she had not tried to hide the pale scar along her collarbone. Mira had insisted, gently but firmly, that hiding it would only give the court reason to believe she was ashamed of something that deserved no shame at all. "Chin up," Mira whispered beside her now, giving her hand a quick squeeze before stepping back into the crowd of gathered nobles. "Remember, you belong here as much as anyone in this room." Leora was not certain she believed that, but she straightened her shoulders anyway, and stepped forward into the hall. Conversation did not stop entirely at her entrance, but it noticeably quieted, dozens of eyes turning toward her with expressions ranging from curiosity to open suspicion. She recognized a few faces from her days wandering the castle grounds, though most remained strangers, their names and ranks unknown to her. She searched instinctively for Kale, and found him near the head of the room, deep in conversation with an older wolf whose gray-streaked hair and weathered face spoke of decades spent in positions of authority. Kale noticed her almost immediately, as though some invisible thread connected his awareness to her presence. He excused himself from the conversation and crossed the hall toward her, and Leora felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly at his approach. "You look well," he said quietly, offering his arm. I feel like every wolf in this room is deciding whether or not to eat me, Leora admitted under her breath. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. They are merely curious. Come, there are several people I would like you to meet. He guided her through the hall, introducing her to members of his council one by one. There was Halvard, the old wolf she had seen him speaking with earlier, who served as the kingdom's chief advisor and studied her with sharp, assessing eyes that gave away nothing of his thoughts. There was Isolde, a striking woman with dark red hair who commanded the eastern border patrols and greeted Leora with a polite but distant nod. There was Bram, younger than the others, who seemed genuinely curious about her rather than suspicious, asking easy questions about her life in Thornhollow that helped, if only slightly, to calm her nerves. Rurik stood near the far wall throughout the evening, watching the proceedings with his arms crossed, never approaching, never speaking to her directly, though Leora caught his eyes on her more than once. Dinner proceeded with careful formality, course after course, served by silent attendants, conversation flowing around Leora, in currents she struggled to follow. She kept close to Cale's side whenever possible, grateful for his steady presence amid the unfamiliar customs and watchful eyes. It was near the end of the meal, as servants began clearing plates and the wine flowed a little more freely, that the tension in the room shifted. A woman Leora had not yet met rose from her seat near the far end of the table, her movements deliberate, drawing attention even before she spoke. She was beautiful, in a sharp, cold way, with pale blonde hair, pulled into an elaborate braid, and eyes the color of winter ice. Leora did not know her name, but the way the room quieted at her rising told her this was someone of significant standing. "Forgive my boldness," the woman said, her voice carrying easily across the hall, "but I find myself curious about our guest's history. Tell me, is it true you were not the daughter originally promised to our king?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water, ripples of murmured conversation spreading through the gathered nobles. Leora felt every eye in the room turn toward her once more, and this time there was no kindness in the attention, only sharp, hungry curiosity. Cale's jaw tightened beside her. "Freya," he said, a warning edge creeping into his voice. "This is neither the time nor the place." "I only wish to understand," Freya continued smoothly, ignoring the warning entirely, "how a king so careful with the strength of his bloodline came to choose a substitute, offered up in a moment of panic by a father desperate to save his own skin. Surely, such circumstances deserve some explanation, for the sake of this court's confidence." Leora felt heat rise in her cheeks, humiliation twisting uncomfortably with anger in her chest. She could feel Cale preparing to respond on her behalf, his posture shifting, his expression darkening, but something in her refused to let him fight this battle alone. "I was not chosen through deception," Leora said, her voice steadier than she expected. "My father attempted deception. I was simply the one standing in the doorway when his plan fell apart. Whatever judgment you wish to pass, I would ask that you pass it on me, not on assumptions about circumstances you did not witness." A brief silence followed her words, and Leora watched several expressions around the hall shift, surprise flickering across faces that had expected either silence or tears, not composed defiance. Freya's eyes narrowed slightly, though a faint, cold smile touched her lips. Well spoken, for a human. She turned her attention back to Cale, though spoken words mean little without the bond to support them. "Tell us, Your Majesty, has the connection revealed itself yet? Or does our court simply wait, indefinitely, on the chance that a human girl might one day prove worthy of a crown, 300 years in the making?" "The bond will reveal itself in its own time," Cale said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority Leora had heard in the square the night they met. "As it always has, for every king before me. I do not answer to impatience, Freya, and I would advise you to remember that before questioning matters that are not yours to judge." Freya inclined her head slightly, a gesture of reluctant deference rather than true respect, and returned to her seat without further comment. But Leora did not miss the way her cold eyes lingered on her for a moment longer, calculating, assessing, clearly unconvinced by anything that had just been said. The rest of the dinner passed with careful politeness, though the earlier warmth of the evening had cooled considerably. Leora found herself relieved when the gathering finally began to disperse, nobles rising from their seats in small groups, conversation shifting to safer, quieter topics as they filtered out of the hall. Kale walked her back through the castle corridors afterward, his silence thoughtful rather than uncomfortable. When they reached the door to her chambers, he paused, studying her with an expression she could not quite name. "You handled Freya well," he said finally. "I do not think she liked my answer," Leora replied. "No," Kale agreed, a faint smile touching his lips. "She did not. But she respected it, whether she wishes to admit that or not." Leora hesitated at her door, curiosity pulling at her despite the late hour. "Who is she?" "Freya. She seemed to carry more weight in that room than the others." Kale's expression grew more serious. "Freya leads one of the oldest and most influential pacts allied with this kingdom. Her support has been valuable to my rule, and her opposition, should it come to that, would not be easily dismissed. She has made her ambitions for greater influence within this court known for some time." "Does she wish to be queen herself?" Leora asked, the question slipping out before she could consider whether it was appropriate. Something flickered across Kale's face, quickly masked. "There was a time when many believed our pacts might be joined through such a union. It never came to pass. Freya has not forgotten that possibility, even if I have long since set it aside." Leora absorbed this information carefully, understanding now the particular sharpness in Freya's questions, the personal edge beneath her political concerns. This was not simply a noble testing a stranger's worthiness for the throne. This was a woman who had once believed that throne might belong to her. "I should let you rest," Kale said, stepping back slightly. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, I am sure. But tonight, you conducted yourself with more grace than most who have stood in that hall before you." "Thank you," Leora said quietly, "for not letting her humiliate me." "You needed no defending," Kale replied. "You defended yourself well enough on your own. I merely reminded the room whose court this remains." He bid her good night and disappeared down the corridor, leaving Leora alone with her thoughts as she slipped into her chambers and closed the door behind her. She changed out of the silver gown slowly, her mind replaying the evening's events, the sharp edge of Freya's questions, the surprising steadiness of her own responses, the warmth that had settled in her chest at Kale's quiet defense. She was preparing to extinguish the candle beside her bed when a soft knock sounded at her door. Surprised, she crossed the room and opened it to find Mira standing in the corridor, her expression troubled. "I did not want to alarm you tonight, during the dinner," Mira said quietly, glancing down the hall as though checking for listeners, "but there is something you should know before tomorrow." Leora's stomach tightened. "What is it?" "Freya did not come to Duskmere merely to attend dinner and ask pointed questions," Mira said. "She arrived 3 days ago, the same week you did, and she has been meeting privately with several members of the council ever since. I do not know what she intends, but I do not believe her presence here is coincidence." Leora felt a chill settle over her that had nothing to do with the mountain air seeping through her window. "You think she is planning something?" "I think," Mira said carefully, "that a woman who once believed she would be queen does not simply accept losing that future gracefully, especially not when a substitute bride, chosen in a moment of chaos, threatens to take her place instead." Leora thought of the cold calculation in Freya's eyes as she had studied her across the dinner table, the barely concealed satisfaction when Kale's answers had failed to fully settle the room's uncertainty. She thought of the whispered conversations Mira described, hidden away from public eyes, and felt the fragile sense of belonging she had begun to build within these walls tremble beneath the weight of a new, unspoken threat. "Does Kale know?" she asked. "I do not know what the king knows," Mira admitted. "But I thought you deserved to know as well, rather than facing whatever comes next without any warning at all." Leora thanked her quietly, and after Mira departed down the darkened corridor, she returned to her bed, though sleep proved elusive for a long while afterward. She lay awake, staring at the shadows dancing across her ceiling, thinking of Freya's cold smile, of secret meetings held in hidden corners of the castle, of the delicate, uncertain bond that Kale claimed might connect them, still unconfirmed, still vulnerable to whatever schemes might be forming in the shadows around her. Whatever peace she had begun to find within these ancient walls, Leora understood now that it remained far from secure. Somewhere within Duskmere, a woman who had once dreamed of wearing the crown Leora now stood accused of stealing, was already moving pieces into place, and Leora had no way of knowing what game she was truly playing, or how much danger lay hidden behind that carefully composed, ice-cold smile. Outside her window, the moon climbed higher over the mountains, indifferent to the quiet storm gathering within the walls below, and Leora finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, haunted by dreams she would not remember clearly by morning, though the unease they carried would linger long after she woke. Morning arrived gray and cold, mist curling low over the mountain paths, visible from Leora's window. She dressed quickly, eager to move, to occupy her mind with something other than the worries Mira's warning had planted the night before. She found her way to the castle library, a quiet room she had discovered during her first week at Duskmere, filled with tall shelves and the comforting smell of old parchment. She had barely settled into a chair near the window, a book of Lycan history open in her lap, when the door opened and Freya stepped inside. Leora's whole body tensed. She had not expected to encounter the woman alone, without the protection of Kale's presence, or the formality of the dinner hall to soften the sharp edges of her words. Freya paused just inside the doorway, her pale eyes sweeping the room before settling on Leora. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, unexpectedly, Freya crossed the room and took the seat across from her, settling into it with the same effortless grace she seemed to carry into every space she entered. "You did not run," Freya observed, studying her closely. "Most humans, faced with the questions I asked you last night, would have fled this castle by now, back to whatever quiet corner of the human world they came from." "I have nowhere left to run to," Leora said honestly. "My father made that quite clear, when he handed me over to your king, rather than face the consequences of his own broken promise." Something shifted in Freya's expression, a flicker of something that might have been understanding, quickly hidden away again, a pragmatic answer. "I did not expect pragmatism from a girl swept up in a fairy tale." "This is not a fairy tale," Leora said quietly. "It is my life, uncertain and frightening as it may be. I would rather understand the truth of my circumstances than pretend they are something softer, something safer than they truly are." Freya studied her for a long moment, and Leora forced herself to meet that cold gaze without flinching, remembering the way she had stood her ground the night before, refusing to let humiliation silence her. "Let me be honest with you then, since you claim to prefer truth over comfort," Freya said finally. "I do not believe you belong in this castle. I do not believe a girl raised in a merchant's house, overlooked and undervalued by her own family, has any place standing beside a king who commands the loyalty of packs across 3 kingdoms. This is not cruelty on my part. It is simply reality." "And yet the king chose me," Leora said. "Not you. Not any other wolf born to this world. Me." "He chose you, in a moment of impulse," Freya countered, though something in her voice suggested the words cost her more effort than she wished to reveal. "Kings are not immune to curiosity, to the pull of something unfamiliar and new. That does not mean the choice was wise, nor does it mean it will endure once the novelty fades." Leora considered this, turning the words over carefully before responding. "Perhaps you are right. Perhaps this will not endure, but that is a truth we will discover together, in time, not something you or I can decide simply by sitting in this library and trading sharp words." A faint, reluctant smile touched Freya's lips, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "You have more spine than I expected, Whitmore. I will grant you that much." She rose from her seat, smoothing the fabric of her gown with practiced elegance. "Enjoy your books. I suspect you will need every scrap of wisdom they contain, if you truly intend to remain in this world." She left as suddenly as she had arrived, and Leora remained seated for a long while afterward, staring at the closed door, trying to understand the strange mixture of hostility and grudging respect that had passed between them. Whatever Freya's true intentions were, whatever schemes Mira suspected might be forming in the shadows of the court, Leora sensed that the woman was not simply cruel for cruelty's sake. There was pain beneath that icy exterior, old wounds and unfulfilled hopes that colored every word she spoke. It did little to ease the unease Leora carried, but it gave her something to consider beyond simple fear, a reminder that even those who seemed most opposed to her presence here carried their own complicated histories, their own reasons for the walls they built around themselves. Later that afternoon, Kale found her still in the library, several books stacked on the table beside her, as she attempted to piece together the history and customs of the world she had been thrust into so suddenly. He studied the small mountain of books with faint amusement. "Determined to understand us, I see," he said, taking the seat across from her. the same seat Freya had occupied hours before. "I would rather understand than simply react," Leora said. "I have spent enough of my life reacting to decisions made by others without any say of my own. I do not wish to continue that pattern here." Something in Cale's expression grew thoughtful, almost tender. "That is a wise approach, wiser than many who have stood where you now stand." He paused, studying her carefully. "Freya spoke with you this morning." "I heard as much from one of the guards." Leora was not entirely surprised that word had traveled so quickly through the castle's quiet corridors. She did. It was not entirely unpleasant, though I would not call it comfortable either. "What did she say to you?" Leora considered how much to share, weighing loyalty to a conversation that had felt, in its own strange way, private, against the growing sense that honesty between herself and Cale mattered more than any small courtesy she might owe Freya. "She believes I do not belong here. She believes your choice was impulsive, that it will not endure." Cale's jaw tightened slightly. Freya has strong opinions about many things, particularly matters that once involved her own ambitions. She mentioned that as well, Leora said carefully. "That there was a time your pacts might have been joined through marriage." "There was," Cale admitted, his voice quiet. "Many years ago, before I became king, before I understood what I now know about the bond I have spent my whole life waiting to find. It was a political consideration, nothing more, though I do not think Freya ever saw it that way." Leora absorbed this, understanding now the deeper currents running beneath Freya's sharp questions and cold assessments. Whatever threat the woman posed, it was tangled up with old disappointment, old hope that had never fully faded despite years passing since it was set aside. "I do not wish to make an enemy of her," Leora said finally, "but I do not know how to avoid it, given the circumstances." "You need not avoid it," Cale said. "You need only remain yourself, honest and steady, as you have been since the night we met. Freya respects strength, even when it comes from unexpected places. In time, I believe she will come to understand that your presence here threatens nothing she has not already lost, long before you arrived." Leora hoped he was right, though the memory of Freya's cold, calculating gaze lingered in her mind for the rest of the day, a quiet reminder that not every challenge within these walls could be resolved through simple honesty and patience alone. Some battles, she suspected, were only just beginning, and she would need every ounce of the quiet strength she had carried through years of being overlooked if she hoped to survive whatever came next. 3 weeks after fleeing Thornhollow, Seraphine Whitmore sat in the back room of a roadside inn 2 towns over, counting the coins she had taken from her father's strongbox before running into the night. There were fewer than she remembered packing, fewer than she needed if she intended to build any kind of life far from the shadow of the Lycan kingdom. She had imagined, in those first frantic hours of escape, that freedom would feel triumphant. Instead, it felt like exhaustion, like hunger, like sleeping in unfamiliar rooms with one eye open, listening for footsteps that might belong to wolves sent to drag her back to a fate she had refused. No footsteps ever came. That was, in its own way, almost worse. Word had reached her, carried through travelers and innkeepers who gossiped freely over shared meals, that her sister had gone in her place, that the Lycan king himself had chosen Leora, quiet, scarred, overlooked Leora, to remain at his side, rather than send her home in disgrace. Seraphine had laughed the first time she heard the story, certain it was exaggeration, the kind of tale that grew taller with each retelling along the road. But the story did not change, no matter how many times she heard it repeated. The king had chosen Leora. Leora, who had spent her whole life standing in Seraphine's shadow, was now living within the walls of Duskmere, perhaps even closer to becoming queen than Seraphine herself had ever imagined being forced to become. The thought unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She told herself it did not matter. She had escaped a fate worse than any inconvenience her sister now faced, hadn't she? Married to a beast, bound to a court of monsters, forced to smile and perform loyalty to a king who could tear a man apart with his bare hands if the old stories held any truth at all. Seraphine had made the wise choice. She had saved herself. And yet, some small, resentful part of her could not stop wondering why it had been so easy for her father to offer Leora up instead, why the substitution had happened so smoothly, as though Leora's life had always been considered a lesser thing, easier to spend when the family's true treasure slipped away. That resentment festered as the weeks passed, feeding on hunger and uncertainty, and the growing realization that a life built on stolen coins and borrowed rooms was not the freedom she had imagined. By the time a letter finally reached her, forwarded through a network of relatives and old family friends scattered across the countryside, Seraphine had grown desperate enough to read it with trembling hands. The letter was from her father. "Seraphine," it began, the familiar slant of his handwriting bringing an unexpected wave of homesickness despite everything. "I do not know where these words will find you, but I pray they reach you soon. Your sister remains within the Lycan court, and though the king has shown restraint regarding your absence, I fear the situation grows more complicated with each passing week. There is talk, even here in Thorn Hollow, of unrest within the kingdom, of factions unhappy with the king's chosen bride. I fear for what might happen should this arrangement fail entirely. Come home, Seraphine. Whatever anger you carry toward me, come home, and we will find a way forward together." Seraphine read the letter 3 times before setting it aside, her mind racing with questions she had no way to answer from this distance. Unrest within the kingdom, factions unhappy with the king's chosen bride. She thought of her sister, alone among wolves who had never wanted her there in the first place, and felt something twist uncomfortably in her chest. Guilt, perhaps, or something closer to fear. She had spent years believing herself the more deserving daughter, the one worthy of attention and protection, while Leora remained invisible in the corners of their father's house. But invisibility, she was beginning to understand, was not the same as safety. Leora had been sent into danger not because she deserved it more, but because she had always been the easier sacrifice. Seraphine folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her bag, staring out the small window of the inn at the road stretching toward the horizon. 2 paths lay before her now. She could continue forward, toward whatever uncertain freedom waited beyond the reach of her father's influence, building a life shaped entirely by her own choices, or she could turn back, toward a kingdom of wolves and a sister she had never truly understood, and face whatever consequences waited for a girl who had run from a fate that had, in the end, fallen upon someone else entirely. She did not decide that night, but the question lingered, unresolved, as she lay awake listening to the creak of the old inn settling around her, wondering, for the first time in her life, what it might mean to choose her sister over herself. In Duskmere, unaware of the letter making its way toward her sister, Leora spent her mornings continuing her lessons with Mira, learning the customs and history of the world she now called home, while her afternoons grew increasingly occupied by quiet conversations with Kale. Their bond, still unconfirmed, still uncertain, had begun to feel less like a mystery to be solved, and more like something growing naturally between them, built from shared meals and honest conversation, rather than any magical certainty. It was during one such afternoon, walking together through the castle gardens beneath a sky heavy with the promise of rain, that Kale first mentioned the growing unrest within his court. "There are members of my council," he said carefully, "who believe your continued presence here, unconfirmed bond or not, weakens perceptions of my authority among neighboring packs. They believe a human bride, chosen through circumstance rather than tradition, invites challenge from those who might seek to test the strength of our alliance." Leora felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. Freya, and others who share her concerns, though not all for the same reasons she carries, Kale admitted. Some genuinely fear for the kingdom's stability. Others simply resent change of any kind. I do not wish to burden you with these concerns, but I believe you deserve honesty regarding the challenges that surround your place here. "I would rather know," Leora said firmly. "I have spent enough of my life protected from difficult truths, only to be blindsided by them later. I do not wish to repeat that pattern." Kale studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering in his golden eyes. "Very well. There is talk of calling a formal council session to discuss whether the pact with Thorn Hollow should be reconsidered entirely, given the unusual circumstances of your arrival." Leora's breath caught. "They wish to send me back." "Some do," Kale admitted. "I have resisted such calls thus far, but resistance alone will not hold indefinitely, not without stronger evidence that the bond between us is genuine, rather than simply my own stubborn insistence against my council's concerns." "And if the bond does not confirm itself in time," Leora asked quietly, "what happens then?" Kale's expression grew troubled, though he did not look away from her. "Then I fear the decision may be taken out of my hands entirely. The rain that had been threatening all afternoon finally began to fall. Light at first, then steadily heavier, driving them both toward the shelter of a nearby covered walkway. Leora stood close to Cale beneath the stone archway, watching the rain sweep across the garden, her mind racing with the implications of what he had just told her. She had begun, without fully realizing it, to build something resembling hope within these walls. Not simply the hope of survival, but something warmer, something that felt dangerously close to belonging. The thought of losing that, of being sent back to Thornhollow, to a father who had only ever seen her as a last resort, filled her with a dread sharper than anything she had felt since the night the wolves first arrived in her town square. "I do not want to leave," she admitted quietly, the words slipping free before she could stop them. Cale turned to look at her, something shifting in his expression, softening into an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "Then we will not let it come to that," he said, his voice low and certain. "Whatever doubts my counsel carries, whatever schemes Freya or others might be forming, I will not allow this kingdom to send you away, simply because patience proves difficult for those who fear change." "You cannot promise that," Leora said softly, though some part of her desperately wanted to believe he could. "No," Cale agreed, "but I can promise to fight for it, with everything a king is capable of commanding." The rain continued to fall around them, a steady curtain of silver droplets catching what little light filtered through the heavy clouds above. Leora studied Cale's face in the dim afternoon light, searching for any trace of doubt behind his words, and found none. Whatever uncertainty surrounded the bond between them, whatever political dangers threatened her fragile place within this kingdom, she believed, in that quiet moment beneath the stone archway, that he meant every word of his promise. It was not enough to fully banish the fear that had settled in her chest since learning of the council's growing concerns. But it was enough, for now, to help her find the courage to face whatever challenges still lay ahead, whatever schemes were forming in the shadows of a court that had never wanted her there in the first place, and whatever choice her sister might yet make, far away on a road leading either toward home or further into the unknown. That evening, as the rain finally eased into a soft mist clinging to the mountainside, Leora found herself seeking out Rurik in the quiet corner of the castle, where he often trained alone after the other guards had retired for the night. She had never approached him directly before, always keeping a careful distance out of respect for the wariness she now understood he carried. But something in Cale's words that afternoon had given her the courage to try. He noticed her before she spoke, pausing mid-motion, his expression guarded as he lowered the practice blade in his hand. "You should not be out here alone," he said, though there was less hostility in his voice than she expected. "I wanted to speak with you," Leora said, standing her ground despite the instinct to retreat. "About Ren." Something flickered across his face, quick and sharp, gone almost as fast as it appeared. "Who told you that name?" "Cale did. I asked him why you seemed so distrustful of me, and he explained enough for me to understand." Leora took a careful step closer. "I am sorry for what happened, for whoever you lost." Rurik studied her for a long moment, his jaw tight, and Leora half expected him to turn away without another word. Instead, he set the practice blade down against the stone wall and exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Her name was Alara," he said quietly. "She was my sister. Ren used her position here to learn the patrol schedules along our northern border, information she sold to a rival pack seeking to weaken our defenses. Alara was among those who died defending that border, ambushed by wolves who should never have known where to strike." Leora felt the weight of his grief settle over her like a physical thing. "That is a terrible loss. I cannot imagine the pain of it." "I do not tell you this for pity," Rurik said, his eyes meeting hers directly, for perhaps the first time since her arrival. "I tell you, because I want you to understand why caution comes so naturally to me, why I have watched you closely since the night you arrived, searching for any sign that you might carry similar intentions." "And have you found any?" Leora asked, holding his gaze steadily, despite the vulnerability of the question. Rurik was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer carefully. "No," he admitted finally. "I have watched you defend yourself with honesty rather than manipulation. I have watched you seek understanding rather than advantage. It does not erase my caution entirely, but it has, I confess, begun to soften it." Leora felt something loosen in her chest at his words, a small but meaningful shift in the fragile balance of trust she had been trying to build within these walls since the night she arrived. "Thank you for telling me. I know it could not have been easy." "Do not mistake this conversation for full trust," Rurik warned, though his tone had lost most of its earlier edge. "I remain the king's beta, sworn to protect this kingdom above all else, including my own comfort. If I come to believe you pose a genuine threat to this court, human or not, bond or not, I will act on that belief without hesitation." "I would expect nothing less," Leora said honestly. "A kingdom deserves protectors who take their duty seriously, even when it makes them difficult to win over." A faint, reluctant almost smile touched the corner of Rurik's mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Perhaps there is more sense in you than I first credited, Whitmore." He picked the practice blade back up, signaling the conversation's end, though something in his posture remained noticeably less guarded than before. "Go inside. The mist grows heavier, and I would not wish to explain to the king why his intended bride caught a chill wandering the training yards after dark." Leora allowed herself a small smile as she turned to head back toward the castle, feeling, for the first time since Mira's warning the night before, that perhaps not every corner of this kingdom stood against her. Some walls, it seemed, could be worn down slowly, one honest conversation at a time. She thought of her sister again as she made her way through the quiet corridors toward her chambers, wondering whether Seraphine had received any word of what had become of her since that chaotic night in Thornhollow, wondering whether guilt or relief or something else entirely occupied her thoughts on whatever road she now traveled. Leora did not know if she would ever see her sister again, did not know whether Seraphine's absence would remain permanent, or whether fate might, in time, draw them back together under circumstances neither of them could yet predict. For now, she had her own battles to face within these walls, her own fragile alliances to build and protect, and as she settled into her bed that night, listening to the soft patter of rain returning against her window, Leora allowed herself, cautiously, to hope that whatever challenges the coming days might bring, she would not have to face them entirely alone. The weeks leading up to the festival passed in a way Leora could never have predicted when she first arrived at Duskmere, trembling and uncertain in her sister's borrowed gown. Each morning brought fewer knots of anxiety and more moments of quiet, unexpected comfort. She began joining Kale for early walks along the castle walls before the rest of the court had risen, watching the sun climb over the mountains while he told her stories of his childhood, of the father he had lost too young, and the responsibilities that had settled onto his shoulders long before he felt ready to carry them. In turn, she found herself sharing pieces of her own life she had never spoken aloud to anyone, not even Mira. She told him about the fire that had left the scar along her collarbone, how she had pulled a younger servant girl from the flames, only to watch her father's gratitude curdle into quiet discomfort at the mark it left behind, as though her courage mattered less than the way it had disfigured her. She told him about years of birthdays where her name was mentioned only after her sister's, about a childhood spent learning to take up as little space as possible in a house that had never quite made room for her. Kale listened to all of it without flinching, without offering the hollow comfort she had grown used to receiving from people who did not know what else to say. Instead, he simply asked questions, careful and genuine, drawing out details she had buried so deeply she had nearly forgotten them herself. "You speak of yourself as though you were a burden," he observed one morning, as they stood together along the eastern wall, watching mist curl through the valley below. "I do not see a burden when I look at you, Leora. I see someone who survived years of being made to feel small, and somehow emerged from it, without losing her honesty, her kindness, or her strength. Sometimes I wonder if I have anything left to offer beyond survival," Leora admitted quietly. "My whole life, I learned to endure. I do not know if I ever truly learned how to simply live." "Then let this be the place you learn," Kale said, turning to face her fully, his golden eyes carrying a warmth that had grown steadily more familiar over the weeks since her arrival. "You do not have to earn your place here through endurance alone. You are already enough, exactly as you are." Leora had not expected words like that to affect her so deeply, but she found herself blinking back unexpected tears, overwhelmed by the simple, quiet kindness of being seen so completely by someone who had every reason, as a king, to demand more polish, more performance, more of the careful perfection her father had always insisted upon in his more favored daughter. It was during these quiet mornings, and the equally quiet evenings that often followed, spent walking together through the castle gardens or sharing simple meals away from the formality of the great hall, that Leora began to understand the true weight of what Cale had told her about the bond weeks earlier. It was not something that arrived suddenly, fully formed and undeniable in a single moment. It grew slowly, built from 1,000 small moments of honesty and trust, each one adding another thread to a connection that felt, by the time the festival of the long moon finally arrived, less like an uncertain mystery, and more like the truest thing she had ever known. Mira noticed the change in her as well, commenting more than once on the way Leora's shoulders had begun to relax, the way her laughter came more easily, the way she no longer flinched instinctively whenever someone addressed her directly in the great hall. "You are becoming yourself," Mira told her one afternoon, helping her arrange her hair after a morning spent in the gardens. Not the girl who arrived here trying to disappear into her sister's stolen gown. Someone entirely her own. Leora had smiled at that, studying her reflection in the mirror, and finding, for the first time, that she recognized the girl looking back at her, recognized her, not as an afterthought or a substitute, but as someone whole and worthy of the space she now occupied. It was against this backdrop of quiet, steady transformation that the festival of the long moon finally arrived 2 weeks later, an ancient Lycan tradition that Mira explained with careful detail as she helped Leora prepare for the evening ceremonies. Once each year, when the moon rose fullest and closest to the mountains, the wolves of Duskmere gathered beneath open sky to honor the bonds that held their kingdom together, family, pack, and, on rare occasions, mates newly discovered among them. It is the night the bond reveals itself most clearly, if it exists at all, Mira explained, carefully arranging a circlet of pale silver flowers through Leora's dark hair. The old stories say the moon itself helps strip away every distraction, every doubt, until only truth remains between two souls meant to be joined. Leora's stomach twisted with nervous anticipation. Weeks had passed since her arrival at Duskmere, weeks of growing closeness with Cale, of quiet conversations and small, unspoken understandings building steadily between them. She had begun to hope, cautiously, that whatever connection drew them together might prove real. But hope and certainty were different things entirely, and tonight, beneath the full weight of the long moon, that uncertainty would finally be tested. "What happens?" she asked carefully, "if nothing is revealed tonight? If the moon shows nothing at all?" Mira's hands paused briefly in her work. "Then the council will have the evidence they have been waiting for, to press their case that you should return home. I do not say this to frighten you, only because I believe you deserve to understand the stakes clearly." Leora nodded, swallowing hard against the fear rising in her throat. She had faced humiliation in her father's house, exile from everything familiar, suspicion from an entire court of strangers, but somehow, the possibility of losing what she had begun to build with Cale, of losing him entirely to nothing more than fate's indifferent verdict, frightened her more than anything that had come before. When Mira finished dressing her in a flowing gown of pale moonlight silver, Leora studied her reflection in the tall mirror standing in the corner of her chambers. The gown caught the candlelight in soft, shifting waves, and for the first time since arriving at Duskmere, she did not see a girl playing dress-up in someone else's life staring back at her. She saw herself, fully and completely, transformed not by borrowed silk but by weeks of learning to stand her ground within a world that had never expected her to belong. The courtyard where the ceremony took place had been transformed as well. Strings of lanterns woven through the branches of ancient trees, their soft golden light mixing with the pale silver glow of the rising moon overhead. Wolves gathered in loose circles throughout the space, some in human form, others already shifted, their fur catching moonlight in shades of gray and brown and deepest black. Music drifted through the night air, low and haunting, played on instruments Leora did not recognize. She found Cale waiting near the center of the courtyard, dressed in dark formal robes that seemed to absorb the surrounding light rather than reflect it. When he saw her approaching, something in his expression shifted, an intensity she had grown familiar with over the past weeks, though tonight it seemed sharper, more focused, carrying the weight of everything that hung in the balance. "You look beautiful," he said quietly, offering his hand. "I am terrified," she admitted, placing her hand in his, despite the tremor she could not fully suppress. "As am I," Cale confessed, surprising her with the honesty of the admission. "Whatever happens tonight, know that these past weeks have already changed something within me, bond confirmed or not." They moved together, toward the center of the courtyard, where Halvard, the elderly council member, waited beside a low stone altar, carved with ancient symbols Leora did not recognize. The gathered crowd quieted as they approached, hundreds of eyes turning toward them with expressions ranging from curiosity to open skepticism. Leora searched the crowd briefly, and found Freya standing near the edge of the gathering, her expression carefully neutral, though something sharp and watchful lingered behind her pale eyes. Halvard raised his hands, and the courtyard fell into complete silence, broken only by the distant sound of wind moving through the mountain pines. "Tonight, beneath the long moon, we witness the truth the moon alone can reveal," Halvard intoned, his voice carrying easily across the gathered crowd, despite its quiet strength. Cale Ashgrave, King of Duskmere, and Leora Whitmore, daughter of Thornhollow, step forward and let the bond, if it exists, make itself known. Cale and Leora moved to stand before the stone altar, facing each other, beneath the full weight of the moon overhead. Leora's heart pounded so loudly she felt certain everyone in the courtyard must hear it. Cale's golden eyes held hers steadily, offering silent reassurance even as his own uncertainty flickered briefly beneath the surface. "Take her hands," Halvard instructed. Cale reached out, and Leora placed her hands in his, the warmth of his skin against hers grounding her against the swelling nervousness threatening to overwhelm her entirely. For a long moment, nothing happened. The courtyard remained silent, the moon continued its slow climb overhead, and Leora felt a creeping dread settle over her, certain that this was the moment everything would fall apart, the moment the fragile hope she had built these past weeks would collapse entirely beneath the weight of fate's indifferent judgment. Then, slowly, warmth began to spread from where their hands connected, a gentle pulse of energy that grew steadily stronger, spreading up through her arms, across her chest, until it seemed to settle somewhere deep within her, resonating with something she could not name but recognized instinctively as true. Cale's breath caught audibly, his golden eyes widening as the same sensation clearly washed over him. Around them, gasps rippled through the gathered crowd, as the space between Cale and Leora began to glow faintly, a soft silver light that seemed to rise from the ground itself, wrapping around their joined hands like something alive. Leora had never experienced anything like it, a warmth that felt like recognition, like coming home to a place she had never known existed until this exact moment. "The bond," Halvard breathed, his weathered face filled with genuine astonishment. "The bond confirms itself." The courtyard erupted into a mixture of gasps and murmured conversation, though Leora barely registered any of it, her entire awareness consumed by the golden eyes staring back at her with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. Cale's hands tightened around hers, and she felt, rather than heard, the low rumble of satisfaction building somewhere deep in his chest. "I felt it," he said quietly, meant only for her ears despite the crowd surrounding them. "From the very first night, I hoped, but I did not know for certain until this moment." "Neither did I," Leora whispered, tears she had not expected gathering at the corners of her eyes. "I did not dare hope too much, in case it proved false." "It is not false," Cale said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "It is the truest thing I have ever known." The silver light around their joined hands slowly faded, though the warmth it left behind remained, settling into something Leora suspected would never fully disappear now that it had been awakened. Halvard stepped forward, addressing the crowd once more, his voice carrying the weight of ancient authority. "Let it be known throughout this kingdom, and beyond its borders," he declared, "that the bond between King Cale Ashgrave and Leora Whitmore has been confirmed beneath the long moon, witnessed by this court, and blessed by the ancient traditions of our people. She shall be recognized as his mate, and in time, as Queen of Duskmere." The courtyard erupted into applause and celebratory howls, the earlier tension and skepticism dissolving into genuine celebration among most of the gathered wolves. Leora caught sight of Mira near the front of the crowd, tears streaming freely down her face as she clapped and cheered. Even Rurik, standing near the edge of the gathering, offered a rare, genuine smile in her direction, a silent acknowledgement of the trust she had slowly earned over these past weeks. Only Freya remained still amid the celebration, her expression unreadable, though Leora caught the briefest flicker of something sharp and calculating cross her features before she turned and disappeared into the crowd. Leora barely had time to register the concern before Cale drew her attention back entirely, his hand rising to gently brush a stray strand of hair from her face, his golden eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the rest of the world fall away entirely. "Whatever comes next," he said quietly, "we face it together now. Truly together, bonded beyond any doubt the council might have raised." "Together," Leora agreed, and for the first time since the wolves had first arrived at her father's door, she felt something settle within her that resembled true, unshakable certainty. Whatever challenges still waited ahead, whatever schemes Freya or others within the court might yet attempt, she would not face them as an outsider desperately seeking acceptance. She would face them as Cale's bonded mate, recognized by ancient tradition and confirmed beneath the light of the long moon itself. The celebration continued long into the night, music and laughter filling the courtyard, as wolves and humans alike honored the confirmed bond with dancing and feasting beneath the star-scattered sky. Leora moved through the festivities at Cale's side, greeted now with genuine warmth by many who had regarded her with suspicion only weeks before, the confirmed bond seeming to melt away much of the earlier hesitation that had surrounded her arrival. Yet even amid the joy of the evening, Leora could not fully shake the memory of Freya's expression as she had slipped away from the celebration, the calculating sharpness that had flickered behind her pale eyes before she disappeared. Whatever the confirmed bond meant for her own standing within the court, Leora understood instinctively that it would not be enough to end every threat gathering in the shadows around her. If anything, the confirmation might only sharpen the resolve of those who had hoped, for their own reasons, that she would fail this test entirely. Later that night, as the celebration finally began to wind down, and guests slowly dispersed toward their chambers, Cale walked her back through the quiet castle corridors, his hands still warm around hers, neither of them quite ready to release the physical connection that had proven, beneath the long moon, to be so much more than simple comfort. "Thank you," Leora said softly, as they reached her chambers, "for choosing me that first night, even before you knew any of this would be true." "I did not choose you because I hoped for this outcome," Cale said, turning to face her fully in the dim corridor light. "I chose you because something in your honesty, your quiet strength, called to me in a way I could not fully explain at the time. The bond simply confirmed what some part of me already knew." Leora felt her heart swell with an emotion too large for words, and when Cale leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wished, she found herself leaning forward instead, meeting him halfway as his lips brushed gently against hers, warm and certain, and carrying within it every unspoken promise of the life now unfolding before them. When they finally parted, Cale rested his forehead gently against hers, his breath still unsteady. "Sleep well tonight, Leora Whitmore. Tomorrow, we begin building a future neither Freya nor any council session can take from us." Leora watched him disappear down the corridor before slipping into her chambers, her heart still racing, her lips still warm from his kiss, and despite the lingering unease surrounding Freya's cold departure from the celebration, she allowed herself, for the first time since arriving at Duskmere, to believe fully in the possibility of happiness waiting for her within these ancient stone walls. Sleep came easily that night, wrapped in the warmth of a bond finally confirmed, but the peace of it did not last long. Just before dawn, a soft knock at her door pulled Leora from her rest, and she opened it to find a tired castle messenger standing in the corridor, a folded letter in his outstretched hand. "Forgive the early hour," he said. "This arrived by rider from the human lands. The seal marks it as urgent." Leora took the letter with a puzzled frown, recognizing her father's handwriting the moment she broke the wax seal. She read it standing in her doorway, the cold morning air forgotten entirely as the words settled over her. "Leora," it began, without the usual formality her father reserved for matters of importance. "Your sister has written to me from the road. She speaks of returning, though I do not know when or if she truly means it. I tell you this not out of affection I have failed to show you these many years, but because I believe you deserve to know the truth of your family's movements, whatever judgment you may hold against us. I have heard, too, whispers of unrest within the Lycan court, concerns among their nobles regarding your place there. I do not know what waits for you in that kingdom, but I find, to my own surprise, that I hope it treats you with more kindness than I ever did." Leora read the letter twice more, before folding it carefully and pressing it against her chest, an unfamiliar tangle of emotions rising within her. Guilt, that her father's rare honesty came only now, after everything. Hope, fragile and uncertain, that her sister might truly be considering a return. And beneath it all, a quiet ache for the family she had never quite had, even as she stood now within a bond stronger than any she had known in her father's house. She thought of showing the letter to Cale, of sharing this small, complicated piece of the life she had left behind. But the hour was early still, and the warmth of the previous night's celebration lingered too precious to disturb just yet with the tangled weight of Thornhollow's unfinished business. She tucked the letter into the drawer of her bedside table instead, promising herself she would speak with him of it soon, once she had found the words to explain a family she barely understood herself. Far away, in a quiet corner of the castle, rarely visited by celebration or joy, Freya sat alone before a cold hearth, her pale eyes fixed on nothing, already turning over plans that would soon threaten everything Leora had only just begun to believe was finally, truly hers. Life at Duskmere settled into a new rhythm in the days following the confirmation of the bond, though Leora quickly learned that a confirmed connection did not erase every shadow lingering within the castle walls. Most of the court had embraced her with genuine warmth, but a small, persistent faction remained unmoved, and Freya's continued absence from public gatherings troubled Leora more than open hostility ever could have. "She has not left the castle," Mira confirmed one afternoon, as they walked together through the eastern gardens, "but she keeps to her private chambers, receiving visitors at odd hours. Several council members have been seen entering her rooms after dark." Leora's stomach tightened at the news. "Does Cale know?" "I imagine he suspects," Mira said carefully. "But without clear evidence of wrongdoing, there is little he can do beyond watching and waiting. Freya has not broken any law simply by receiving guests in her own chambers." Leora considered this as they continued their walk, the earlier warmth of the festival still lingering in her memory, even as new uncertainty crept back in to replace it. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that the confirmed bond would settle every question surrounding her place at Duskmere. Instead, it seemed to have simply shifted the nature of the threats gathering against her, from open doubt into something quieter and, perhaps, more dangerous. That evening, she found Cale in his private study, a room lined with maps and old books that he retreated to whenever the weight of ruling grew heavy on his shoulders. He looked up as she entered, and the tired lines around his eyes eased slightly at the sight of her. "You have heard about Freya's meetings," he said, before she could raise the subject herself. "Mira mentioned it," Leora admitted, taking the seat across from his desk. "Are you concerned?" Cale set down the papers he had been reviewing, rubbing a hand across his tired eyes. "I am always concerned when a council member, as influential as Freya, begins gathering allies in private. Whether her intentions are truly dangerous, or simply the product of wounded pride, I cannot yet say. But I have asked Rurik to watch her movements closely." "What can I do?" Leora asked. "I do not wish to simply wait and hope nothing comes of it." "For now, patience," Cale said, though his expression suggested he understood how difficult that request might be. "Freya respects strength, but she is also cautious. She will not move against us without careful preparation, which gives us time to understand her true intentions before she acts on them." Leora nodded, though the reassurance did little to fully settle the unease that had taken root in her chest since Mira's warning weeks earlier. She thought of the letter still tucked away in her bedside drawer, of her father's admission, and her sister's uncertain plans, and found herself suddenly eager to share this piece of her past with Cale, as though speaking it aloud might help lighten the weight of everything else pressing down upon her. "There is something I should tell you," she said quietly, and proceeded to explain the letter that had arrived the morning after the festival, watching Cale's expression carefully as she spoke. "Your sister may return," he said slowly, once she had finished. "How does that make you feel?" Leora considered the question honestly before answering. "Uncertain. Part of me is glad, I think, that she might come to understand what she left behind. But another part of me worries what her return might mean. For our family, and perhaps for the pact between our kingdoms." "The pact required a daughter of Whitmore," Cale reminded her gently, That requirement has already been fulfilled, through you. Your sister's return, should it happen, changes nothing regarding your place here. I know, Leora said. But I cannot help wondering if her return might complicate things regardless. If Freya, or others like her, might try to use Seraphine somehow, to argue that the wrong sister remains at your side. Kale's expression grew thoughtful at this, and Leora could see him turning the possibility over carefully in his mind. It is a fair concern, he admitted. One I had not fully considered until you raised it. Perhaps it would be wise to send word ahead, ensuring your sister's return, should it happen, occurs with full transparency, rather than becoming fodder for whatever schemes Freya might already be forming. They spent the rest of the evening discussing the matter further, and by the time Leora finally retired to her chambers, she felt a small measure of relief at having shared the burden of her family's uncertain situation with someone who took her concerns seriously, rather than dismissing them. The following days brought no immediate resolution to the quiet tension surrounding Freya's private meetings, but Leora found herself drawn increasingly into the daily rhythms of castle life, taking on small responsibilities that Mira and Kale both encouraged as a way of establishing her place within the court more firmly. She began assisting with the kingdom's correspondence, reviewing petitions from villages within Duskmir's territory, learning the delicate balance of diplomacy that governed relations between the various pacts allied with Kale's rule. Rurik, too, began seeking her out more frequently, their earlier wariness giving way to something that resembled genuine friendship, built on the foundation of honesty they had established weeks before. He taught her, during quiet afternoons in the training yard, some of the basic signals and codes used by Duskmir's guards, explaining that a future queen should understand at least the fundamentals of how her kingdom's protection functioned. You are taking this responsibility seriously, he observed one afternoon, watching her practice a simple defensive stance he had shown her earlier. Many in your position might simply enjoy the comfort of the crown, without concerning themselves with its burdens. I do not wish to simply enjoy comfort I have not earned, Leora replied, adjusting her stance as he had instructed. If I am to stand beside Kale as queen, I want to understand every part of what that means, not simply the parts that are pleasant. Rurik's expression carried something close to genuine respect as he nodded, moving to correct the position of her feet. Ilara would have liked you, I think, he said quietly, the admission clearly costing him something significant to share. She always said the strongest wolves were not the ones born to power, but the ones who chose, again and again, to rise to meet it. Leora felt the weight of the compliment settle over her, understanding the significance of Rurik invoking his sister's memory in connection with her own growing place within the kingdom. Thank you, she said softly. That means more to me than you know. Their afternoons together continued in this manner over the following weeks, Rurik's guarded caution giving way slowly to genuine trust, until Leora found herself counting him among the small circle of allies she had built within Duskmir's walls, alongside Mira's steady friendship and the growing depth of her bond with Kale. Yet even as these connections strengthened, the shadow of Freya's continued private meetings lingered at the edges of Leora's growing sense of security, a quiet reminder that not every threat within these walls had been resolved simply by the moon's confirmation of her bond with Kale. She found herself some nights lying awake and wondering what exactly was being discussed behind Freya's closed doors, what alliances were being formed, what plans were slowly taking shape in the shadows of a court that had, on the surface, largely come to accept her presence. It was during one such sleepless night, nearly a month after the festival, that Leora rose from her bed and made her way quietly through the darkened castle corridors, drawn by a restless need to simply move, to occupy her racing mind with something other than uncertain worry. She did not intend to go anywhere in particular, but her feet carried her, almost without conscious thought, toward the wing of the castle, where Freya's private chambers were located. She stopped short at the sound of hushed voices drifting from behind a partially closed door, recognizing Freya's cool, measured tone, even before she could make out the words being spoken. Leora hesitated, torn between the instinct to retreat immediately and the pressing need to understand exactly what threat might be forming against everything she had built within these walls. Carefully, silently, she crept closer to the door, straining to catch the conversation happening just beyond it, unaware that the choice she made in this single, quiet moment would set into motion consequences far greater than she could yet imagine. The bond changes nothing about how vulnerable this makes us, Freya was saying, her voice low but sharp with conviction. A king bound to a human mate is a king with a weakness every rival pack in the region will learn to exploit. It does not matter how the moon blessed them, it matters how the other kingdoms perceive it. A second voice answered, gravelly and unfamiliar to Leora. The council will not move against a confirmed bond without cause, Freya. You know this. Halvard witnessed it himself. Half the court already treats her as queen in all but title. Then we must give them cause, Freya replied, and something in her tone made the hair rise on the back of Leora's neck. Not harm. I have told you, I want no part of anything that draws blood, but doubt. Suspicion. If her loyalty can be questioned publicly, convincingly, the bond alone will not be enough to hold the council's confidence. And how do you propose we manufacture doubt around a bond the moon itself confirmed? Her family, Freya said. The sister who fled, rather than face this fate herself. If she returns, and if certain arrangements are made regarding how and why she returns, it would not be difficult to suggest the Whitmore family has been playing a longer game than anyone first suspected. A substitution planned from the start, perhaps, to place a spy within these walls rather than a true bride. Leora's breath caught painfully in her throat. She pressed her hand flat against the cold stone wall to steady herself, her mind racing through the implications of what she had just heard. Freya intended to use Seraphine to twist her sister's return into evidence of some imagined conspiracy, poisoning the court's trust in Leora through nothing more than careful suggestion and manufactured suspicion. That is a dangerous game, the gravelly voice warned. If the king discovers you orchestrated such a scheme, the king will discover nothing, Freya cut in, her confidence absolute. I intend no direct action against the girl herself. I merely intend to ensure that when her sister does return, certain facts reach the right ears, framed in the right light. The rest will unfold naturally, the way suspicion always does once planted in fertile soil. Leora had heard enough. She backed away from the door as quietly as she had approached, her heart hammering violently against her ribs, her thoughts a chaotic tangle of fear and fury. Freya did not intend violence, it seemed, but the threat she posed was, in its own way, far more insidious. A whispered lie, carefully planted, could unravel trust built over months in a matter of days, and Leora had learned firsthand, growing up in her father's house, how easily a single doubt could reshape an entire household's perception of a person's worth. She made her way back through the darkened corridors toward her own chambers, her mind racing through every possible response. She could tell Cale immediately, though she had no proof beyond her own overheard testimony, easily dismissed as misunderstanding or exaggeration born of fear. She could confront Freya directly, though such a confrontation would only reveal that she knew of the scheme, likely driving Freya's plans further underground, where they would be even harder to counter. Or she could wait, watch, and gather the evidence needed to expose the plan fully before it had the chance to take root. By the time she reached her chambers and closed the door softly behind her, Leora had settled on a plan of her own, uncertain and frightening as it felt to consider confronting a threat of this nature without the full protection of Cale's authority behind her. She would need to warn her sister, somehow, before Seraphine's eventual return could be twisted into a weapon against them both. She would need allies she could trust completely, people who could help her watch for the signs of Freya's scheme taking shape without alerting Freya herself to the fact that her private conversation had been overheard. She thought immediately of Rurik, of the trust they had built together over these past weeks, and of Mira, whose loyalty had never once wavered since that first morning Leora had woken alone and frightened in an unfamiliar bed. Whatever came next, she would not face it in silence, hoping the danger might simply pass on its own. She had spent too many years in silence already, invisible and unheard in her father's house. She would not repeat that mistake now, not when so much more than her own comfort hung in the balance. Sleep did not come easily that night, her mind turning over every possible consequence of what she had overheard, every careful word she would need to choose when the time came to act. But beneath the fear, a new and unfamiliar resolve had begun to settle into place, steady and unshakable, the quiet certainty of a woman who had finally learned that being overlooked did not mean being powerless, and that the strength she carried within her, cultivated through years of enduring dismissal and doubt, might now prove to be exactly what this kingdom needed most. Morning brought no relief from the weight of what Leora had overheard. She dressed quickly, her mind still racing through the conversation she had witnessed, and made her way directly to Cale's study, before she could talk herself out of sharing everything she knew. He looked up from his papers as she entered, his expression shifting immediately to concern at whatever he saw in her face. "What has happened?" Leora closed the door behind her, and recounted the entire conversation she had overheard outside Freya's chambers, watching Cale's expression darken with each detail she shared. By the time she finished, his hands had curled into tight fists atop his desk, his jaw tense with barely contained anger. "She would use your sister as a weapon against you," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Manufacture suspicion, where none is warranted, simply to protect her own wounded pride." "I do not have proof," Leora reminded him. "Only what I heard with my own ears. If I accuse her directly, she will simply deny it, and I will have revealed that I was listening at her door in the middle of the night. It will make me appear paranoid, perhaps even guilty of exactly the deception she hopes to suggest." Cale considered this, his expression grim but thoughtful. "Then we do not accuse her directly. Not yet. We prepare instead, so that when your sister does return, we control the narrative surrounding her arrival, rather than allowing Freya the opportunity to shape it first." "How?" Leora asked. "We send word to Thornhollow ourselves," Cale said, already reaching for a fresh sheet of parchment. "A formal invitation, extended openly, welcoming your sister to Duskmere, under the full protection and transparency of the Crown. If her return is announced by us, publicly and without secrecy, there will be no room for Freya to twist the circumstances into something sinister." Leora felt a small measure of relief at the plan, though the fear of what still might unfold did not fully leave her. "And if Freya attempts something else, some other angle we have not anticipated? Then we will face it as it comes," Cale said, his golden eyes meeting hers with quiet determination. "You are not facing this alone, Leora. Whatever Freya intends, she underestimates how much this kingdom has already come to trust you, bond confirmed or not." They spent the rest of the morning drafting the letter together, careful in its wording, warm in its welcome, ensuring that any future arrival by Seraphine would be understood by the entire court as an event orchestrated openly by the Crown itself, rather than something requiring suspicion or secrecy. Cale dispatched a rider before midday, and Leora found herself watching from the castle walls as the messenger disappeared down the winding mountain road, carrying with him the fragile hope that her family's complicated history might yet be woven into something safer than Freya's careful scheming intended. Rurik, once informed of the overheard conversation, took the news with the same grim seriousness Cale had shown, immediately increasing the discreet watch he kept over Freya's movements throughout the castle. "She is careful," he warned Leora during one of their afternoon training sessions. "But careful people still make mistakes eventually, especially when they believe themselves unwatched." "What kind of mistake?" Leora asked. "The kind that reveals intention rather than mere suspicion," Rurik said. "We simply need patience enough to catch it when it comes." Patience, Leora was learning, seemed to be the great unifying demand of court life at Duskmere, a virtue she had never particularly cultivated during her years of quiet invisibility in Thornhollow, where waiting had only ever meant waiting, to be overlooked once again. But this waiting felt different, purposeful rather than passive, and she found herself growing steadily more confident in her ability to navigate the treacherous currents of political intrigue that ran beneath the surface of castle life. Nearly 2 weeks passed before word arrived that Seraphine had indeed accepted the Crown's invitation, her carriage expected to arrive at Duskmere's gates within the coming days. Leora received the news with a complicated tangle of emotions, relief that her sister had chosen to return, rather than continue running indefinitely, but also anxiety at the prospect of facing Seraphine again, after everything that had transpired since that chaotic night in Thornhollow's Square. "Are you ready to see her?" Mira asked gently, as they walked together through the gardens the evening before Seraphine's expected arrival. "I do not know," Leora admitted honestly. "Part of me wants to be angry with her, for running, for leaving me to face a fate she refused to accept herself. But another part of me understands her fear completely. I might have run too, if I had believed I had anywhere else to go." "Perhaps you can hold both feelings at once," Mira suggested. "Anger and understanding are not always opposites. Sometimes they simply exist together, waiting for time to sort out which one settles deeper. Leora considered this wisdom as she prepared for bed that night, uncertain what tomorrow's reunion might bring, uncertain whether the sister who arrived would be the same confident, dismissive girl who had fled Thornhollow months earlier, or someone changed by the weeks spent alone on the road, forced to reckon with consequences she had never before been required to face. Seraphine's carriage arrived just past midday, rolling through Duskmere's great gates beneath a sky heavy with gathering clouds. Leora stood beside Cale at the top of the castle steps, watching as the carriage door opened and her sister stepped down into the courtyard, looking smaller and more uncertain than Leora had ever seen her. Seraphine's golden hair had lost some of its careful polish, her traveling clothes plain and road-worn, rather than the fine silks she had always favored. She looked up at the castle towers with wide, apprehensive eyes, before her gaze finally settled on Leora, standing at the top of the steps. For a long moment, neither sister moved, the weight of months of separation and unresolved history hanging heavy in the air between them. Then, slowly, Seraphine climbed the steps until she stood directly before Leora, her expression carrying none of the confident dismissal Leora remembered from their childhood. "I did not know if you would want to see me," Seraphine said quietly, her voice smaller than Leora had ever heard it. "I did not know either," Leora admitted honestly. "But I am glad you came." Something in Seraphine's carefully composed expression cracked at those words, tears welling in her eyes despite her obvious effort to hold them back. "I am sorry, Leora, for running, for leaving you to face something I was too frightened to face myself. I have thought of little else these past months, wondering what became of you, hating myself for choosing my own comfort over your safety." Leora studied her sister's face, searching for any trace of the old dismissiveness that had characterized so much of their relationship growing up, and found instead genuine remorse, genuine fear finally giving way to genuine reflection. "You could not have known what would happen," Leora said gently. "And I have found, against every expectation, a life here that has given me more than Thornhollow ever did." Seraphine's eyes moved past her to where Cale stood watching the reunion with quiet patience, and something like understanding dawned across her features. "You are truly happy here," she said, her voice carrying genuine surprise. "I am," Leora confirmed, and found, saying the words aloud, that she meant them completely. Cale stepped forward then, offering Seraphine a formal but warm welcome, and Leora watched with cautious relief as her sister accepted his greeting, with none of the fear she had once expressed about wolves and monsters, seeming instead to recognize, even in this brief first meeting, the same quiet strength and integrity that Leora had come to know so well over the past months. The reunion, however, did not go unnoticed by other eyes within the castle. Leora caught sight of Freya watching from a distant window, as the sisters embraced properly for the first time since Thornhollow, her pale expression unreadable, though Leora did not miss the calculating way her eyes moved between Seraphine and the gathered crowd, clearly already searching for some angle to exploit in this unexpected reunion. That evening, a formal dinner was arranged to properly welcome Seraphine to Duskmere, and Leora found herself watching the gathering with careful attention, alert to any sign that Freya intended to move forward with whatever scheme she had been quietly assembling since the night of the overheard conversation. Seraphine, for her part, conducted herself with a humility and grace that surprised Leora considerably, answering questions from curious council members with honest, careful answers, rather than the practiced charm she had always relied upon in Thornhollow. It was near the end of the meal, much as it had happened during Leora's own first formal dinner months earlier, that Freya finally made her move, rising from her seat with the same deliberate confidence Leora remembered from that first uncomfortable evening. "Welcome to Duskmere," Freya said, addressing Seraphine directly, her tone carrying a warmth that immediately set Leora on edge, knowing what lay beneath its carefully constructed surface. "I confess, I find myself curious about the circumstances of your departure from Thornhollow, and now, your return. Tell me, what finally convinced you to reconsider a fate you once fled so completely?" The question hung in the air, seemingly innocent, though Leora recognized immediately the trap being carefully constructed beneath its polite phrasing. Whatever answer Seraphine gave now would be carefully parsed, twisted if possible, into evidence supporting whatever narrative Freya intended to build. Seraphine, to her credit, did not flinch beneath the weight of the question. I fled because I was afraid, she said honestly, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet hall. I am not proud of that fear, nor of the choice it led me to make. I return now, because I have come to understand that courage does not always mean facing danger without hesitation. Sometimes, it means finding the strength, eventually, to face the consequences of your own choices, however delayed that courage might arrive. A murmur of approval rippled through several sections of the gathered nobles, and Leora felt a swell of pride for her sister's honest, unguarded answer. Freya's expression flickered briefly with something like frustration, before smoothing back into careful neutrality. A noble sentiment, Freya said smoothly, though I wonder, given the timing of your return, whether other motivations might be at play. Word travels quickly, even to distant human towns, regarding matters of political significance within this kingdom. If you are asking whether I returned because I heard my sister had found happiness here, and wished to share in that joy after months of guilt over abandoning her, then yes, Seraphine said, her voice growing steadier with each word. That is precisely my motivation. I make no claim to nobler intentions than a sister's love and a sister's regret. Leora watched Freya's careful trap collapse beneath the simple weight of her sister's honesty, and for the first time since overhearing that fateful conversation outside Freya's chambers, she allowed herself to hope that whatever scheme had been building in the shadows might yet fail to find the fertile ground it required to take root. After the dinner concluded, Leora found Seraphine alone in the castle gardens, sitting quietly on a stone bench beneath the pale light of a half-moon, her earlier composure finally giving way to visible exhaustion. Leora settled beside her without a word, the silence between them comfortable in a way their relationship had rarely allowed for back in Thornhollow. That woman does not like me, Seraphine said eventually, breaking the quiet. Or perhaps it is you she does not like, and I am simply convenient for whatever purpose she intends. Freya believes she should have been the one standing where I stand now, Leora explained carefully. There was once talk of a match between her pack and Kale's, before he became king. She has not fully let go of what that loss cost her, and I fear she means to use your return somehow, to cast doubt on whether our arrival here was ever truly innocent. Seraphine's brow furrowed as she absorbed this. She thinks we planned this, that father sent you deliberately, and I fled deliberately, as part of some scheme to plant a spy within these walls. Something close to that, yes, Leora admitted. A short, disbelieving laugh escaped Seraphine, though there was no humor in it. If only she knew how little planning went into any of it. Father barely planned his own breakfast most mornings, let alone a conspiracy against a kingdom of wolves. Despite everything, Leora found herself smiling at that, some of the tension in her shoulders easing at the familiar, dry honesty in her sister's voice, a trait she remembered fondly from the rare moments in childhood when Seraphine had let her guard down entirely. I know it is absurd, but absurd things can still cause real harm, if enough people choose to believe them. Then we make certain they have no reason to believe it, Seraphine said, straightening with sudden resolve. I will stay as long as you need me to, Leora. I will answer every question this court throws at me, honestly, until there is nothing left for that woman to twist into suspicion. I owe you that much, and more besides. Leora studied her sister's face in the moonlight, searching for any trace of the old resentment or dismissiveness that had once defined so much of their relationship, and found instead something new, something that looked remarkably like genuine loyalty. Thank you, she said softly. I did not expect this version of you when I saw your carriage arrive today. Neither did I, if I am honest, Seraphine admitted. Running taught me things I never wanted to learn about myself, mostly that I am not nearly as brave as I always believed, and that the people I dismissed as less important than myself were often stronger than I ever gave them credit for being. The sisters sat together a while longer, speaking of smaller things now, memories of their mother who had passed when they were young, quiet observations about the strange, beautiful world of Duskmere that Seraphine was only beginning to understand. It was, Leora reflected as she finally rose to return to her chambers, the most honest conversation she and her sister had shared in years, perhaps in their entire lives, and she found herself grateful, despite every danger still gathering in the shadows, for the unexpected gift of finally knowing Seraphine as something more than a rival for their father's limited affection. Freya, meanwhile, did not retire quietly to her chambers, as the other guests dispersed. She lingered instead near the edge of the courtyard, watching the sisters through the garden hedges with narrowed eyes, before turning and making her way toward the castle's private stables, where a single rider waited, saddled and ready, cloaked against the night chill. "You heard enough tonight to understand the difficulty," Freya said quietly to the waiting figure, whose face remained hidden beneath the shadow of a deep hood. "The sisters present a united front now, one the council will not easily doubt through simple suggestion alone. We require something more concrete. A document, a witness, something that cannot be dismissed as mere rumor." "Such things can be arranged," the hooded figure said, his voice carrying the rough accent of the human border towns. "For the right price." "Price is not a concern," Freya said coldly. "Only results. I want proof, real or convincingly constructed, that the Whitmore family's arrangement with this kingdom was never as innocent as it now appears. Bring me something the council cannot ignore, and you will be compensated, beyond anything you could earn in a lifetime along that border." The hooded rider nodded once before mounting his horse and disappearing into the darkness beyond the stable gates, leaving Freya alone beneath the star-scattered sky, her expression carrying none of the careful warmth she had shown during dinner, only the cold, patient calculation of a woman unwilling to accept defeat simply because her first attempt had failed to find purchase. She turned back toward the castle, already planning her next move, unaware that her private conversation in the stables had not gone entirely unwitnessed. In the shadows near the far wall, a young stable hand loyal to Rurik had heard enough of the exchange to understand its significance, and within the hour, word of Freya's midnight meeting had begun making its way quietly through the castle's network of watchful eyes, back toward the one man determined to ensure that whatever scheme Freya intended to unleash would not catch Duskmir's king, or his bonded mate, unprepared. But as the dinner concluded and guests began to disperse, Leora caught one final glimpse of Freya's expression before she slipped away into the darkened courtyard, and the calculating coldness she saw there told her clearly that tonight's failed attempt would not be the last. Freya was not a woman easily deterred by a single setback, and Leora understood, with a chill that had nothing to do with the castle's cool evening air, that whatever came next would require every ounce of the strength and unity she and Kale had built together to withstand. Rurik brought word of the stable hand's account to Kale and Leora the following morning, his expression grim as he relayed every detail he had gathered. A hooded rider, paid in coin for something Freya called proof, concrete enough that the council could not dismiss it as rumor. The stable hand did not hear enough to know exactly what form this proof might take, but the intention was clear enough. Kale's expression darkened considerably as he absorbed the report. "She means to fabricate evidence. Something that will appear legitimate enough to convince the council that the Whitmore family orchestrated their arrival here as some manner of deception. Forged documents, perhaps," Leora suggested, her mind racing through the possibilities. "A letter, claiming to be from my father, revealing some hidden agreement with a rival kingdom. Or a false witness, paid to claim knowledge of a conspiracy that never existed. Either would be difficult to disprove quickly, especially once doubt has been planted," Rurik said. "The council does not require absolute proof to grow suspicious, only enough uncertainty to justify caution regarding your continued place here." Leora felt the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in her chest, though beneath the fear, something steadier had begun to take root as well, a determination born from months of learning to stand her ground within this court, rather than simply endure whatever came her way. "Then we must find a way to expose her scheme before whatever false proof she commissions can reach the council's ears." "How?" Kale asked. "We do not know precisely what she intends to fabricate, nor when it will arrive." Leora considered the problem carefully, drawing on everything she had learned during her months at Duskmere, the careful diplomacy of court politics, the value of patience Rurik had taught her, the honest directness that had served her well against Freya's sharper questions during that first difficult dinner. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "we do not need to know exactly what she intends. Perhaps we simply need to ensure that when she presents whatever false proof she has commissioned, the council already trusts the truth more than they trust her word." "Explain," Kale said, leaning forward with interest. "A formal audience," Leora suggested, "before the full council, where Seraphine and I speak openly about everything that happened in Thorn Hollow, from the moment your riders arrived to this very morning. If the council hears the full, honest truth directly from us, unfiltered by rumor or suggestion, it will be far more difficult for Freya's fabricated evidence to find purchase later, no matter how convincing it might appear on the surface. Cale studied her for a long moment, something like admiration flickering across his features. A bold strategy. It carries risk, exposing yourself fully before a council that has not always shown you the warmest welcome. I have faced worse risks these past months, Leora said, thinking of that first terrifying night in Thornhollow Square, of every uncertain moment since. I would rather face this challenge directly than wait anxiously for whatever scheme Freya intends to unleash against us. Rurik nodded slowly, clearly weighing the merits of the plan. It is a sound strategy, Your Majesty. Truth spoken openly, before doubt can be planted, often proves more resilient than truth revealed only in defense after suspicion has already taken root. Cale agreed to arrange the formal audience for 3 days hence, giving the council proper notice while still moving quickly enough to hopefully outpace whatever timeline Freya's hired rider might be working toward. Leora spent the following days preparing carefully with Seraphine, the sisters reviewing every detail of their story together, ensuring their accounts would align honestly and completely when presented before the full council. I am nervous, Seraphine admitted, the evening before the audience, as they sat together in Leora's chambers, reviewing their preparation one final time. I have never spoken before a room of wolves who hold my fate, and yours, in their judgment. Simply tell the truth, Leora advised. That has served me well since the very first night I arrived here. The truth does not require performance or careful calculation. It only requires honesty, however uncomfortable that honesty might feel. Seraphine nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the fabric of her gown. I am proud of you, Leora, for everything you have built here, despite every obstacle placed before you. I do not think I ever told you that, in all the years we shared a house together. You are telling me now, Leora said gently. That is enough. The morning of the audience arrived clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the great hall's tall windows as the full council gathered to hear the formal address Cale had arranged. Leora stood beside Seraphine near the center of the hall, Cale positioned at the head of the room alongside Halvard, whose weathered face carried its usual careful neutrality, though Leora thought she caught a flicker of curiosity in his eyes as the proceedings began. Freya sat among the gathered council members, her expression carefully composed, though Leora did not miss the slight tension in her shoulders, the wariness in her pale eyes, as she watched the unexpected audience unfold before her. Cale addressed the council first, explaining the purpose of the gathering with careful, measured words. In recent weeks, questions have circulated regarding the circumstances of Leora Whitmore's arrival at Duskmere, and now, her sister's return. I have called this audience so that both women may address these questions directly, openly, before this full council, rather than allowing rumor and speculation to continue shaping perceptions that deserve the clarity of honest testimony. Leora stepped forward when Cale gestured for her to begin, her heart pounding but her voice steady as she recounted the full story from the beginning. She spoke of her father's panic when Seraphine fled, of being thrust forward as a desperate substitute, with no plan or scheme behind it, beyond a frightened man's attempt to save his own household from ruin. She spoke of Cale's recognition that night, of the scent that revealed her deception before any words could, of the mercy he had shown, rather than the punishment her father had feared. There was no conspiracy, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. There was only chaos, fear, and a father who valued his reputation more than either of his daughter's well-being. I did not come here seeking to deceive this kingdom. I came here because I had no other choice, and I remained, because, against every expectation I carried that first terrifying night, I found something here worth staying for. Seraphine spoke next, echoing much of what Leora had shared, while adding her own perspective on the fear that had driven her to flee, the guilt that had eventually brought her back. I am not proud of my choice to run, she admitted, before the full council, but I can promise you, with complete honesty, that no scheme existed behind either my departure or my return. I fled because I was frightened of wolves and stories I did not understand. I returned because I learned, from a distance, that my sister had found something in this kingdom that Thornhollow never gave either of us: belonging. A murmur moved through the gathered council as Seraphine finished speaking, and Leora watched carefully for any reaction from Freya, who remained still and composed, though her pale eyes had grown noticeably sharper, calculating, as though recalculating whatever plan she had been counting on to unfold in the days ahead. Halvard rose slowly once the sisters had finished, his weathered voice carrying the weight of decades spent serving this council's deliberations. I have listened carefully to both accounts, and I find nothing in either testimony that suggests deception beyond the understandable panic of frightened people caught in extraordinary circumstances. I move that this council formally set aside any lingering questions regarding the legitimacy of the Whitmore family's arrangement with this kingdom. Several council members voiced their agreement, and though a few, including members of Freya's closer allies, remained visibly hesitant, the overall mood of the room had shifted noticeably toward acceptance rather than suspicion. Leora felt a wave of relief wash over her as the formal audience drew to a close. Though she did not miss Freya's expression as the council dispersed, the barely concealed frustration flickering behind her carefully maintained composure. Whatever false proof Freya had commissioned from her hooded rider, it seemed the honest testimony offered today had gone a long way toward inoculating the council against whatever fabricated doubt she still hoped to introduce. But as Leora watched Freya rise and depart the hall without a word, she understood, with a certainty that settled deep and cold in her chest, that a woman as determined as Freya would not simply abandon her scheme because one attempt had failed to find purchase. She would adapt. She would find another angle, another weakness to exploit, and Leora suspected the true confrontation between them had only just begun to take shape. That suspicion proved accurate sooner than Leora expected. 4 days after the formal audience, a messenger arrived at Duskmere's gates bearing a sealed letter, addressed directly to Halvard, marked with a wax stamp Leora did not recognize. Word of its arrival spread quickly through the castle, and by that evening, Mira arrived at Leora's chambers with a troubled expression, explaining that Halvard had called an emergency session of the council for the following morning. "What does the letter say?" Leora asked, her stomach already twisting with dread. "I do not know the full contents," Mira admitted, "but I overheard enough to understand it claims to be a confession, written by a man who once served in your father's household, alleging that Elias Whitmore arranged your presence here, specifically to gather information for a rival kingdom, using your sister's staged flight as cover for the true scheme." Leora felt the blood drain from her face. That is exactly what Freya described wanting, that night outside her chambers. A document the council cannot easily dismiss. She found Kale immediately, sharing Mira's account, and watched his expression harden into something colder and more determined than she had seen from him since the night they first met. "A forged confession, timed perfectly to arrive after the goodwill built by your audience with the council. She is clever. I will grant her that much." "What do we do?" Leora asked, fear creeping back into her voice, despite every effort to remain steady. "We meet the claim directly," Kale said. "If this letter names a specific servant from your father's household, we can send word to Thornhollow immediately, seeking confirmation of whether such a man exists at all, and if he does, whether his account holds any truth, beyond what Freya has paid him to say." Rurik, summoned quickly to join the conversation, agreed with the plan but cautioned patience. "A rider to Thornhollow and back will take the better part of a week. The council session is tomorrow morning. We may not have the luxury of proof in hand before we are forced to respond to the accusation directly." "Then we respond with what we do have," Leora said, steadying her voice through sheer determination. "Consistency, honesty, and the willingness to face this accusation without flinching, exactly as we did before." Kale studied her carefully, something like fierce pride flickering behind his golden eyes. "You are remarkable, you know. Most people, faced with a fabricated confession threatening everything they have built, would crumble beneath the weight of it. I have spent my whole life being underestimated," Leora said quietly. "I do not intend to let a stranger's paid lie succeed where years of my own father's dismissal failed." Rurik dispatched a rider toward Thornhollow before dawn regardless, in hopes that even partial confirmation might arrive before the matter concluded entirely, while Kale spent the remainder of the evening reviewing the letter itself, searching for any inconsistency that might betray its fabricated nature. Leora sat with him long into the night, poring over the careful, deliberate handwriting, searching for any detail that felt wrong, any name or claim that did not align with the truth she knew so intimately. It was well past midnight when Leora finally noticed it, a small detail buried within the second paragraph of the alleged confession. The letter claimed the servant had worked in the Whitmore household for nearly a decade, present for supposed secret meetings between Elias and agents of a rival kingdom. But Leora had grown up in that house, had known every servant who passed through its halls during her childhood, and the name signed at the bottom of the letter belonged to no one she had ever encountered in all her years living beneath her father's roof. "This name," she said, pointing to the careful signature at the letter's close. "I do not know it. Not from any decade of my life in that house. Whoever wrote this either invented the servant entirely, or borrowed a name from somewhere else, never expecting anyone to know the household well enough to notice the discrepancy." Cale studied the name carefully, then looked up at her, with something close to relief flickering across his tired features. "It is not proof of forgery on its own, but it is enough of an inconsistency to raise doubt before the council tomorrow. Enough, perhaps, to buy the time we need, until word returns from Thornhollow, confirming the truth completely." They worked together late into the night, preparing their response for the morning's emergency session, and though exhaustion weighed heavily on both of them by the time they finally parted ways toward their separate chambers, Leora felt something steadier settle within her chest as well, the quiet confidence of having found a genuine thread to pull. One that might, with careful handling, unravel Freya's carefully constructed scheme entirely, before it could do any lasting damage to everything she had worked so hard to build within these walls. Leora barely slept in the hours before dawn, her mind cycling endlessly through every possible version of what the coming council session might bring. She rose before the sun had fully cleared the mountains, dressing carefully in a simple gown of deep blue, one Mira had once told her carried the old meaning of steadfastness among Lycan tradition. She wanted every part of herself, from her posture to the careful choice of her clothing, to communicate the same message: steady, unshaken, unwilling to be moved by lies dressed up as truth. Seraphine joined her shortly after, her own nerves evident in the careful way she smoothed her skirts again and again, though her chin remained lifted, with a determination that would have been unrecognizable in the girl who fled Thornhollow months earlier. "Whatever happens in there," Seraphine said quietly, as they walked together toward the council chamber, "I want you to know, I do not regret coming back. Not for a moment. Not even facing something like this." "Neither do I," Leora said, and found, despite the fear coiling tightly in her stomach, that she meant it completely. Mira caught them just outside the chamber doors, pressing a small, warm hand against Leora's arm. Rurik sent word only minutes ago. The second rider carrying news from Thornhollow should arrive within the hour, perhaps sooner if the horses hold their pace. Whatever Halvard asks of you this morning, know that confirmation is close behind. The reassurance helped steady Leora's racing heart only slightly as she entered the chamber and took her place beside Cale, whose expression carried the same controlled calm she had come to associate with moments of genuine danger, a stillness that masked a readiness to act the instant it became necessary. He glanced at her once, a silent question in his golden eyes, and she answered with the smallest of nods, ready as she would ever be. The council chamber felt colder than usual the following morning, gray light filtering through tall windows as members filed in with expressions ranging from concern to poorly hidden anticipation. Leora stood beside Cale near the head of the room, Seraphine positioned close behind her, while Halvard took his place at the center podium, the sealed letter now unsealed and resting on the table before him. Freya sat among the council members, her posture perfectly composed, though Leora noticed the faint tightness around her eyes, the careful stillness of someone waiting to see whether months of patient scheming would finally bear fruit. "This council convenes on urgent matter," Halvard began, his weathered voice carrying easily through the silent chamber. "A letter has arrived, purporting to be a confession from a former servant of the Whitmore household, alleging that Leora Whitmore's presence within these walls was orchestrated deliberately, as part of a scheme to gather intelligence on behalf of a rival kingdom." A ripple of murmured conversation moved through the gathered council before Halvard raised a hand for silence. Given the gravity of this claim, and given the formal audience held only days ago, where both Whitmore sisters testified openly before this body, I believe it only fair that they be given opportunity to respond directly, before we proceed further. Cale stepped forward first, his voice carrying the same commanding authority Leora remembered from that first night in Thornhollow's Square. Before my mate responds, I would ask this council to consider the timing of this letter's arrival. 4 days after a formal audience that satisfied every reasonable question this body raised, a conveniently detailed confession appears, naming a servant no member of this council has ever verified existed within the Whitmore household. The letter provides sufficient detail to suggest legitimacy, interjected one of the council members allied closely with Freya, a broad-shouldered wolf named Corwin, whose skepticism toward Leora had never fully softened since her arrival. Detail alone does not prove fabrication, Your Majesty. No, Leora agreed, stepping forward before Cale could respond. But inconsistency does. She gestured toward the letter resting on Halvard's table. This confession claims its author served in my father's household for nearly a decade. I grew up in that house. I knew every servant who worked within its walls during my childhood, by name and by face. The name signed to this letter belongs to no one I have ever encountered in all my years living beneath my father's roof. Murmurs spread through the chamber once more, and Leora watched Freya's composed expression flicker, just slightly, at the introduction of this detail. Perhaps your memory fails you, Corwin suggested, though his tone carried less confidence than before. It has been many months since you departed that household. Perhaps, Leora acknowledged evenly, though I would suggest a simpler explanation deserves this council's consideration as well. That whoever commissioned this letter did not know the household intimately enough to invent a name that would withstand scrutiny from someone who actually lived there. Halvard studied the letter carefully once more, his weathered face thoughtful. This is a fair point, and one that warrants investigation before this council makes any judgment based on the letter's claims alone. A rider was dispatched to Thornhollow at dawn yesterday, Cale added, seeking confirmation of whether such a servant exists at all, and if so, whether any truth underlies the claims made in his name. I would ask this council's patience until that confirmation, or lack thereof, returns to us. Freya rose slowly from her seat then, her composure fully restored, her voice carrying the same cool confidence Leora had come to recognize during their earlier confrontations. Patience is a reasonable request, Your Majesty, though I wonder whether the convenience of an unnamed inconsistency, discovered so quickly by the very person accused within the letter, deserves quite the credibility this council seems eager to grant it. Leora felt her pulse quicken at the accusation, understanding immediately that Freya intended to turn the very evidence disproving the letter into further suspicion against her. I discovered the inconsistency because I know my own childhood home better than any forger, sitting comfortably in this castle ever could, Leora said, her voice steady, despite the anger building beneath her composure. That is not convenience, Freya. That is simply truth, available to anyone willing to look closely enough to find it. The chamber fell silent at the direct exchange, every council member's attention fixed on the two women facing each other across the room. Freya's pale eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, Leora wondered if she had overstepped, revealing too much of the private tension that had existed between them since that very first dinner months earlier. You speak with great confidence for someone whose entire presence in this kingdom began with deception, Freya said coldly. Your father lied to this council once already, presenting you in your sister's place. Why should this body trust that no further deception underlies your continued presence here? Because the moon does not lie, Cale interjected, his voice carrying a warning edge that silenced the chamber immediately. The bond confirmed between Leora and myself beneath the long moon cannot be forged, cannot be manipulated by any scheme, however carefully constructed. Whatever doubts linger regarding the circumstances of her arrival, that truth remains beyond question. Bonds have been known to form under unusual circumstances before, Freya pressed, though her voice had grown slightly less certain beneath the weight of Cale's authority. It does not preclude the possibility of other, more troubling truths existing alongside it. Before the exchange could escalate further, the chamber doors opened suddenly, admitting a travel-worn rider whose horse's exhaustion was evident even through the closed doors. Rurik, who had been standing quietly near the entrance throughout the proceedings, moved quickly to intercept the messenger, exchanging hurried words before turning back toward the assembled council. Word has returned from Thornhollow, Rurik announced, his voice carrying clearly across the silent chamber. Faster than expected, thanks to a second rider who happened to be traveling this direction already. The town records confirm no servant by the name signed to this letter has ever been employed within the Whitmore household, not in the past decade, nor at any point in recorded memory. A wave of murmured reaction swept through the council chamber, and Leora watched relief and vindication settle over Cale's features even as Freya's composure finally began to crack entirely, her pale eyes widening slightly before she caught herself, smoothing her expression back into careful neutrality. Furthermore, Rurik continued, the writer carries a signed statement from the town magistrate of Thornhollow, confirming that a man matching the general description in the letter was seen only weeks ago, in the company of a woman matching Lady Freya's description, at an inn along the border road frequented by those seeking discreet business away from prying eyes. The chamber erupted into open exclamation at this revelation, council members turning toward Freya with expressions of shock and dawning suspicion. Freya's face had gone pale, all pretense of calm finally abandoned as she rose to her feet, her earlier confidence replaced by something closer to panic. "This is preposterous," she said, though her voice lacked its usual commanding certainty. "A vague description from a border town magistrate proves nothing. Any number of women might match such a description." "Perhaps," Halvard said gravely, rising from his seat at the podium, his weathered face carrying an expression of deep disappointment. "But combined with the fabricated name, the convenient timing following our formal audience, and the private meetings this council has been made aware you conducted with hooded strangers in the castle stables, the pattern of evidence grows difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence." Freya's eyes darted around the chamber, searching for allies among the assembled council members, but found instead expressions ranging from disappointment to open condemnation. Even Corwin, who had defended her position moments earlier, now regarded her with visible unease. "I acted only out of concern for this kingdom's stability," Freya said finally, her voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier confidence. "A human mate weakens our standing among rival packs, who have long questioned the strength of our bloodline. I sought only to protect what generations before us built." "You sought to protect your own wounded pride," Cale said, his voice carrying quiet but absolute authority. "I understand the disappointment you carried, Freya, from a match that never came to pass between us. But that disappointment does not grant you license to fabricate evidence against my mate, to threaten the stability of this kingdom through lies and manufactured doubt." Freya said nothing for a long moment, her earlier composure fully shattered, replaced by something that looked, to Leora's surprise, almost like genuine grief, rather than simple defeat. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Halvard looked to Cale, deferring the judgment to the king's authority. Cale considered the question carefully, his expression thoughtful despite the anger Leora knew he still carried beneath his controlled exterior. "Formal exile," Cale said finally. "Not death, not imprisonment, though this council would be within its rights to demand harsher judgment given the severity of your actions. You will leave Duskmere's territory by week's end, your standing among allied packs formally revoked, your influence within this court permanently ended. I extend this mercy not for your sake, but out of respect for the genuine service your pack provided this kingdom in years past, before ambition and wounded pride led you toward this current path." Freya absorbed the judgment in silence, her earlier defiance finally giving way to quiet acceptance. She turned, briefly, to look at Leora directly, and something passed between them in that final exchange, not quite an apology, but perhaps the closest thing to acknowledgement that Freya was capable of offering. "You proved stronger than I expected," Freya said quietly, before turning and departing the chamber without another word, her allies among the council, watching her exit, with expressions that suggested whatever loyalty they had once carried toward her cause had evaporated entirely beneath the weight of her exposed deception. The chamber remained quiet for a long moment after her departure, the weight of everything that had unfolded settling slowly over the gathered council. Halvard finally broke the silence, addressing the room with renewed formality. "Let it be recorded that this council formally and permanently sets aside any question regarding the legitimacy of Leora Whitmore's place within this kingdom, and further condemns the actions taken against her through fabricated evidence and manufactured suspicion." A wave of applause and approving murmurs swept through the chamber, and Leora felt Cale's hand find hers, warm and steady, as the council began to disperse around them. Seraphine, standing close behind, embraced her tightly, the moment the formal proceedings concluded, tears of relief streaming freely down her face. "It is over," Seraphine whispered. "It is over," Leora agreed, though something in her chest still carried the lingering weight of everything that had transpired these past months, from that terrifying night in Thornhollow's Square to this final, hard-won vindication before the full council of Duskmere. Cale turned to face her fully, once the chamber had mostly emptied, his golden eyes carrying an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs entirely. "You faced every challenge this kingdom placed before you," he said quietly, "and you emerged stronger for each one. I do not know many who could have withstood what you have withstood these past months, human or wolf. I did not face it alone," Leora reminded him gently. "I had you. I had Rurik and Mira, and eventually, my sister as well. Whatever strength I found it because this kingdom, despite every initial suspicion, gave me people worth fighting for." Cale leaned down slowly, and this time, when their lips met, there was no uncertainty behind it, no lingering question of whether the bond between them would prove strong enough to withstand whatever challenges still lay ahead. There was only the quiet, absolute certainty of two people who had faced genuine danger together and emerged, finally, on the other side of it, ready to build the future that had once seemed so impossibly uncertain on that first terrifying night beneath Thornhollow's torchlit sky. Word of the council's ruling spread through Duskmere within hours, carried from servant to guard to kitchen hand, until the entire castle seemed to hum with the news. By evening, Leora could not walk the corridors without receiving warm nods and genuine smiles from wolves who had once regarded her with open suspicion. Their earlier wariness finally dissolved beneath the undeniable evidence of Freya's exposed deception and the steady grace with which Leora had met every challenge placed before her. Rurik found her that evening near the training yard, his expression carrying an unfamiliar warmth as he approached. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "I doubted you, in the beginning, more than I let myself admit even to Cale. I am glad to have been proven wrong." "You had good reason for your caution," Leora reminded him gently. "I would not ask you to apologize for protecting the people you love, even if that protection meant doubting me at first." "Still," Rurik said, "you have earned more than my grudging trust now. You have earned my genuine respect and my loyalty for whatever that is worth to a future queen." "It is worth a great deal," Leora said honestly, touched by the sincerity in his voice. Mira arrived shortly after, practically glowing with happiness as she embraced Leora tightly. "I always believed in you," she said. "From that very first morning, when you asked whether wolves could truly be kind, I knew then you would find your place here, whatever obstacles stood in your way." The following days brought a quiet, welcome peace to Duskmere, the tension that had gripped the castle for months finally beginning to ease. Freya departed as ordered, her carriage disappearing down the mountain road without ceremony or farewell, and though a few of her closest allies among the council remained watchful and reserved, the majority of Duskmere's court had firmly embraced Leora's place among them, no longer as a curious stranger tolerated out of respect for the king's choice, but as a genuine member of their community, earned through months of honesty, patience, and quiet strength. Seraphine, too, found herself settling into an unexpected rhythm within the castle, extending her stay far beyond what either sister had originally anticipated. She began spending time with Mira, learning small pieces of Lycan history and custom, and even struck up a tentative, careful friendship with Bram, the young council member who had shown genuine curiosity toward Leora from her very first dinner at Duskmere. "I think I understand now," Seraphine admitted one evening, as the sisters sat together watching the sunset paint the mountains in soft shades of orange and gold. "Why you did not wish to return to Thornhollow, even when Father's letter offered the possibility. This place feels more like home than that house ever did, doesn't it?" "It does," Leora agreed, "though I am glad you found your way back here too. Whatever complicated history exists between us, I would rather build something new with you than carry old resentments forward into whatever comes next." Seraphine reached over and took her sister's hand, a small, simple gesture that carried more warmth than years of careful distance ever had. "Whatever comes next," she echoed quietly. "I would like to be part of it, if you will have me." "Always," Leora said, and meant it completely, watching the last light of the sunset fade slowly behind the mountains as the first stars began to emerge overhead, the promise of tomorrow stretching out before them both, finally free of the shadows that had followed them from Thornhollow to this unexpected, hard-won home. Autumn settled over Duskmere with a golden warmth that softened the mountain peaks and filled the castle gardens with the rich scent of ripening fruit. Nearly a year had passed since the night Leora first stood trembling in her sister's borrowed silk, waiting for judgment beneath the Lycan king's watchful gaze. Now, as she stood before the tall mirror in her chambers, watching Mira arrange the final details of a gown far grander than anything she had worn before, Leora found herself hardly recognizing the fearful girl she had once been. The gown was the deep silver blue of a winter sky just before dawn, embroidered with delicate silver thread that traced patterns of running wolves beneath a crescent moon, the same symbol that marked every banner hanging throughout Duskmere's ancient halls. A crown of pale silver, simple but unmistakably regal, waited on a velvet cushion nearby, ready to be placed upon her head before the assembled court and allied packs traveling from across the region to witness the formal coronation. "You look every bit the queen you have already become," Mira said softly, stepping back to admire her work, tears glistening in her warm brown eyes. "I do not feel ready," Leora admitted, though the words carried none of the fear that similar admissions had once held. This was simply honest uncertainty, the natural nervousness of someone about to accept a responsibility she intended to carry with everything she had to give. "No one ever feels fully ready," Mira said wisely. "Not for the moments that matter most. Readiness comes afterward, built through the living of it, one day at a time." A soft knock interrupted them, and Seraphine entered, dressed in elegant blue that complemented her sister's gown, without competing with it, her golden hair, arranged in an elaborate braid, that caught the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows. In the months since her return, Seraphine had transformed as thoroughly as Leora had, her earlier vanity giving way to genuine warmth, her dismissiveness replaced by careful attentiveness that had earned her a respected place within Duskmere's court in her own right. "Father has arrived," Seraphine said, her expression carefully neutral. "He is waiting in the receiving hall, requesting a moment before the ceremony begins." Leora felt an old, familiar tension settle in her chest at the mention of her father. Word of the coronation had reached Thornhollow weeks earlier, and though Cale had left the decision of whether to invite Elias entirely in her hands, Leora had ultimately chosen to extend the invitation, uncertain whether she sought closure, reconciliation, or simply the satisfaction of standing before him transformed into someone he could no longer overlook or dismiss. "I will see him," Leora said finally, rising from her seat before the mirror. She found her father waiting alone in the quiet receiving hall, looking smaller and older than she remembered, his once confident bearing softened by the passage of months, and, perhaps, by whatever reflection had occupied him since watching both his daughters build lives entirely separate from the household he had once ruled, with such careful control. He turned as she entered, and something in his expression shifted at the sight of her, an emotion she did not remember ever seeing directed toward her before. "Leora," he said, his voice carrying an unfamiliar uncertainty. You look every bit a queen." "Thank you for coming," Leora said carefully, keeping a measured distance between them despite the strange pull of old habit that urged her to seek his approval, exactly as she had for so many years in his house. "I did not know if I deserved the invitation," Elias admitted quietly. "After everything, after the years I overlooked you, the night I sent you into a fate I believed was beneath consideration, believing you the lesser sacrifice, I have had many months to reflect on the kind of father I was to you, Leora, and I do not find much within that reflection to be proud of." Leora studied his face carefully, searching for the same careless dismissal she remembered from her childhood, and found instead something that looked, cautiously, like genuine remorse. "You were not a kind father to me," she said honestly, refusing to soften a truth she had carried in silence for far too many years. "You valued my sister's beauty over my worth, my scar over my strength, my quiet nature over anything you considered worthy of your attention." Elias flinched at the directness of her words but did not look away. "I will not ask you to forgive years of neglect in a single conversation, nor do I believe I have earned such forgiveness simply by arriving here today. I only wish to see, with my own eyes, the woman my daughter has become, and to tell her, however late this admission arrives, that I am proud of her, truly proud, in a way I never properly expressed when it might have mattered most." Leora felt something complicated shift within her chest. Not forgiveness exactly. Not yet, but perhaps the beginning of something that might eventually grow into it, given enough time and enough evidence that her father's words carried genuine weight rather than convenient performance. "I appreciate you saying that," she said finally. "I cannot promise you the relationship we might have had things been different between us all those years. But I am willing to build something new, slowly, if you are willing to earn it, rather than simply expect it." "That is more grace than I have any right to ask for," Elias said quietly, "and more than I expected to receive." "Thank you, Leora." They spoke a while longer, careful and measured, neither pretending the conversation erased years of accumulated hurt, but both willing, cautiously, to consider what a different kind of relationship between them might look like moving forward. When the time came for Leora to depart toward the ceremony, her father bowed formally, a gesture of respect he had never once extended to her during all her years living beneath his roof. The coronation itself unfolded beneath a clear autumn sky, the castle courtyard transformed with banners and flowers. Hundreds of guests gathered from packs across the region, alongside representatives from several human territories, who had traveled to witness the historic joining of wolf and human tradition. Leora stood at the center of it all, Kale beside her, as Halvard raised the silver crown high before the assembled crowd. "Let it be known throughout every kingdom touched by this ceremony," Halvard proclaimed, his weathered voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard, "that Leora Whitmore, once overlooked, once dismissed, has proven herself through honesty, through courage, and through unwavering strength, to be worthy of standing as Queen of Duskmere, bonded eternally to King Kale Ashgrave, beneath the blessing of the long moon." The crown settled onto her head, cool and surprisingly light despite the weight of everything it represented, and as the assembled crowd erupted into cheers and celebratory howls, Leora felt Kale's hand find hers, warm and steady, exactly as it had been since that very first night in Thornhollow's torchlit square. "You did it," he murmured, leaning close enough that only she could hear the words over the roar of celebration surrounding them. "You transformed every doubt this kingdom once carried into genuine, unshakable respect." "We did it," Leora corrected gently. "Together." She caught sight of her small circle of allies scattered throughout the cheering crowd, Mira, weeping openly with joy near the front, Rurik offering a rare, genuine smile as he clapped alongside the other guards, Seraphine beaming with pride beside their father, whose expression carried a complicated mixture of regret and genuine happiness, as he watched his daughter accept a crown he had never once believed her capable of earning. As the formal ceremony concluded and the celebration stretched long into the evening, music and laughter filling the courtyard beneath a sky gradually darkening toward the emergence of the first stars, Leora found a quiet moment to step away from the festivities, drawn toward the same stone wall overlooking the valley where she and Kale had shared so many important conversations over the past year. Kale found her there a short while later, joining her at the wall's edge, watching the distant lights of scattered villages begin to twinkle across the darkening valley below. "Do you remember," she said softly, "that first night, when you told me my father sent you honesty wrapped in fear, rather than beauty wrapped in silk?" "I remember," Kale said, a faint smile touching his lips. "I did not know then how completely that fear would transform into something far stronger." "I did not know either," Leora admitted. "I only knew I refused to disappear again, the way I had disappeared for so many years in my father's house. Whatever this kingdom demanded of me, I decided I would face it as myself, fully and completely, rather than trying to become whatever version of a bride others expected me to be." "That decision," Kale said, turning to face her fully, the last light of sunset catching in his golden eyes, "is precisely why you stand here now, crowned not simply as my mate, but as a queen this entire kingdom has come to genuinely respect and love." Leora reached up, gently touching the crown still resting upon her head, and thought of the frightened girl who had once stood invisible in the corners of her father's house, overlooked and undervalued, never once imagining that a single terrifying night might lead her toward a life so completely, unexpectedly her own. She thought of Freya's cold ambition, ultimately undone by the simple, unshakable power of honest truth. She thought of Rurik's hard-won trust, of Mira's steady friendship, of Seraphine's slow, genuine transformation from rival to devoted sister. and of her father's belated, imperfect attempt at reconciliation. Every difficult step of the journey had led, ultimately, to this exact moment, standing beside a king who had chosen her not for beauty or convenience, but for the very qualities her own family had once dismissed as worthless. "Whatever comes next," Cale said quietly, drawing her close against the cooling evening air, "we face it together, exactly as we have faced everything since that first night." "Together," Leora agreed, resting her head against his shoulder, as the stars fully emerged overhead, scattered like scattered promises across the vast, darkening sky. Behind them, the celebration continued long into the night, music and laughter echoing through Duskmere's ancient halls, honoring not simply the crowning of a new queen, but the quiet, extraordinary triumph of a girl who had once been told she was not beautiful enough, not worthy enough, not important enough to matter, and who had proven, through nothing more than honest courage and unshakable strength, that she had been worthy of everything, all along. In the seasons that followed, Duskmere flourished under the joined rule of its king and queen, the kingdom's alliances strengthening as word spread of the human queen, who had faced betrayal, suspicion, and manufactured scandal with unwavering grace. Villages along the border, once wary of the pact between wolf and human kingdoms, began sending emissaries, eager to establish trade and friendship, with a court now known for its fairness and honesty, rather than fear alone. Rurik rose eventually to serve as Cale's most trusted advisor, his early caution long since transformed into genuine devotion, both to his king and to the queen he had once regarded with such deep suspicion. He never fully stopped watching over Leora with the same careful vigilance he had shown from her very first night at Duskmere, though now that vigilance carried the warmth of loyal friendship rather than wary distrust. Mira remained close at Leora's side as well, no longer simply a caretaker assigned to ease a frightened stranger's transition into castle life, but a beloved friend and trusted confidant who helped guide the queen through the ongoing challenges of ruling a kingdom, still finding its balance between old traditions and new possibilities. Seraphine, in time, found her own place within Duskmere, entirely separate from her sister's shadow, eventually establishing herself as a respected voice within the court's growing diplomatic efforts between human and Lycan territories, her natural charm finally put toward purposes far more meaningful than simply securing her father's favor. She and Bram grew close over the following year, their careful friendship blossoming slowly into something neither had expected, but both came to treasure deeply. Elias visited occasionally in the years that followed, each visit marked by small, careful steps toward the relationship he had never built with his elder daughter during her childhood. Leora never fully forgot the years of dismissal and neglect that had shaped so much of her early life, but she found, gradually, room within her heart to accept her father's imperfect efforts at reconciliation, understanding that growth, however delayed, still carried genuine value. Of Freya, little was heard beyond occasional rumors carried through traveling merchants, tales of a woman who had rebuilt a smaller, quieter life, far from the political ambitions that had once consumed her. Whether she ever found peace with the loss of everything she had once hoped to claim, Leora never learned for certain, though she found herself, on quiet evenings, hoping that somewhere, Freya had discovered a version of contentment that did not depend on crowns or thrones, or the approval of courts long since moved past her influence. Duskmere itself changed slowly under Leora's steady guidance, growing into a kingdom known not simply for the strength of its wolves, but for the wisdom and compassion of a queen who understood, more intimately than any ruler before her, what it meant to be overlooked, underestimated, and ultimately, triumphantly proven worthy of every bit of respect and love a kingdom could offer. And on quiet mornings, when mist curled low over the mountain valleys and the first light of dawn spilled golden across Duskmere's ancient stone walls, Leora often found herself standing once more, at that same familiar wall, overlooking the valley below, remembering the frightened, invisible girl she had once been, and marveling, with quiet gratitude, at the extraordinary, unexpected life that single terrifying night in Thornhollow's torchlit square had ultimately given her. The girl no one had chosen had become the queen an entire kingdom had come to cherish, and in the warm circle of Cale's steady presence beside her, Leora finally understood, completely and without doubt, that she had always been enough. She simply needed the right eyes and the right heart to finally see it.